2,700 journalists and analysts. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
We're now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution.
The battery problem may be the biggest unsolved problem in all of technology.
Every time the United States has done great transformative things, there's been a partnership between governments and the private sector.
With a willing partner to ensure competitiveness and draw in investment in the United States, Canada's going to be able to be even more ambitious.
The objective for Glasgow, first and foremost, is to keep that 1.5 degree temperature rise within reach.
The train has left the station. Investors care about it. People who work inside of corporate America care about these issues. And certainly we see that with just the broader community.
There's not enough tax in the world for private sector to pay for all of this. It's going to have to be a public-private partnership.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Right now, about half of U.S. households invest. We'd like to get that number up to 95+%. Investing should be as ubiquitous as shopping online. It should just be something that people do.
From New York City this morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Monday morning, and here's the price action on the S&P 500, 41.73, bouncing back 21 points on the S&P, taking a bite out of last week's loss. We're up 0.5%. In the bond market, yields basically unchanged at 161.65. In foreign exchange, euro stronger, euro dollar 122.16, up about 1/3%. And just to round things out quickly, because we need to get to some news, 64.85 on WTI, called it 83, up about 2 percentage points there. The Irish Prime Minister, Tom, with some strong words a couple of hours ago, calling the forced landing of the Ryanair flight an act of piracy. Now, it's just going to be very interesting to me how we get from this strong rhetoric to sanctions that match that rhetoric, given that this is a country that is already heavily sanctioned.
our team's been working on it through the weekend here. We're scheduled to be with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and we're trying to link up with him now. Our Maria Tadeo in Brussels following this story as well. It may be range-bound on the screen, but the political range of Europe has changed. Martin Schenker is our editor-at-large in charge of all of our political coverage. All of a sudden, Marty, when the facts change, President Biden will change. Suddenly, it will be a very different European trip.
It certainly will. This is, I've been doing this for quite a long time. It's one of the most bizarre stories that I've seen in quite a while.
And it's got to be the idea of a Russian response. If we're dealing with a guy who's predictable in his unpredictability, I think we've all observed that. Minsk's only 116 miles from the Baltic states and the Baltic border. Fine, but it is Moscow that will have to adapt and adjust.
Yeah, and, Joe Biden has keeps saying that he's looking forward to his meeting with Vladimir Putin. That hasn't been set in stone yet. We expect it to happen pretty soon. But that conversation is going to take on a new sense of urgency because of what happened this weekend.
Marty, what on earth can we expect from that meeting? It's like living in an alternative universe. When you hear what the Europeans have got to say, and then you hear Russia's response to this, the foreign ministry reportedly calling the Western reaction to the Ryanair incident as shocking. They've been accused by Belarus of trying to politicize the event. How do you have a conversation with someone on the other side of a table that sees a completely different world to the one you see?
Yeah, and it's not unprecedented. I mean, when Vladimir Putin was asked about Russian interference in elections, he just said, well, it didn't happen. And that's his reality. Whether it's true or not is sort of not important to him. He just wants to make sure that he keeps the West on edge, and he's doing just that.
So what's the U.S. response going to be? We've heard from certain European countries, including Germany, with respect to the airspace over Belarus. Is the U.S. expected to come out with something stronger than perhaps just additional sanctions in an already heavily sanctioned country, as John mentioned?
Yeah, Lisa, it's kind of hard to imagine what more we can do to sanction Belarus. And the other factor here is there is a pro-democracy movement in Belarus. If you completely isolate them, you're also isolating that movement. So they have to be very careful about how they respond.
And this is actually somewhat parallel, at least in that manner, to Iran, because for a while, the Iranian response to the government had been an increasingly democratic one, at least among the populace. And then when the U.S. cracked down, that became more complicated. Now we're getting word from Tony Blinken and others that they want to see a return to the Iranian nuclear agreement that we had before. What's the progress going to be on that?
Well, I do think that they are interested in getting Iran back into the nuclear accord, and on Iran's part, they certainly would like the sanctions to be eased. That'll have implications for oil more than anything else in terms of the supply that will be put back into the marketplace if Iran's sanctions are lifted.
Open question. What are you watching in Washington this week? We've sort of stumbled. One of the news items, maybe Bloomberg, I can't remember, talked about infrastructure, can't find the bridge to the other side. What in Washington captures your attention this week?
Well, we have a story this morning about how Democrats are becoming increasingly uneasy over Joe Biden's tax plans. That balanced with some attempt to do a deal on infrastructure this week with the Republicans, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
The heart of the matter, given the politics we all know was dealt the first Tuesday of November last year, he doesn't have the votes, right?
Well, it's not clear if he has the votes. Look, the one thing that Biden has said is inaction is not acceptable. So he will twist arms. He'll somehow manage to get something done on taxes and infrastructure, in my opinion.
Marty, it makes me wonder where we've seen progress over the last couple of weeks. We had Senator Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, speaking to ABC over the weekend on the scope of the bill. And just one line, one question, I think, gets everyone's attention. What is infrastructure? Marty, they're still having that conversation.
Right.
So what kind of progress have we made over the last several weeks?
Well, I do think that there is an agreement on what traditional infrastructure is, and that the Republicans are willing to go there if Joe Biden is willing to go there as well. But it's all that soft infrastructure stuff that the Republicans don't want any part of. But I do think Joe Biden will reach some deal with the Republicans.
Can we wrap things up, Marty, by talking about Big Phil getting it done over the weekend? Mickelson, how romantic was that to see Phil Mickelson come back and win another major?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they talk about Phil Mickelson being 50 years old. To me, that's a young man, not an old man. But it is extraordinary. You also had Tom Brady, the oldest quarterback to win a Super Bowl this year. So it's been the senior moment.
I remember the senior moment where the skates said, I said go, and the skates said no.
Yes.
I mean, I remember that moment. I believe it was in the vicinity of 42 in my amateur state. Putting at that level at age 50?
It's pretty good. But you also remember Gordie Howe, right? He played hockey when he was 50 years old.
What we would do, Tom, Marty, what we would do to see Tiger and Phil together again in a major playing golf, wouldn't that be something?
That would be good.
That would be great. Yeah. Remains to be seen whether Tiger's going to golf again.
Is this a sports report, John?
No, I just thought we should get Phil Mickelson in.
Well, I thought Garrett.
Just, it's the right thing to do.
You know, I mean, I look at what we've got going. I mean, Gareth.
I was waiting for that.
I
was waiting for that.
He steps on the field and
I deliberately
good things
started this
happen.
conversation a little bit earlier so that we could talk about your tots, making it happen. You'll be playing on Thursday nights. Guess who'll be playing on Tuesday and Wednesday nights? AC Milan, back in a Champions League.
Yeah, well, they're not. But I just, this old thing of Gareth Bale or Phil Mickelson, I mean, they both delivered in spades.
Yeah, Gareth is a little bit younger, to be honest,
Yeah,
Tom.
but in that game, I mean, he's up against 20-year-olds.
You certainly don't get it done in football at 50 years old.
Yeah.
He's just trying to come up with a segue. Come on. A segui, excuse me. It's like both of them won. Both of them were there. Yeah, a segui. It's fantastic.
We're doing golf because I think the majority of our audience are probably interested in who won the golf over the weekend.
Did you actually watch it, John?
I watched a bit of it, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Tom, did you watch it?
Sunday. I usually watch the fourth round.
It's watching Red Sox Padres.
I watched the final round.
Which
I've seen your Padres T-shirts, Tom. I really don't know what I think of this.
They're destined. I mean,
they're destined.
It's fun. It's fun.
What happens to the Red
three
Sox?
best teams in baseball are all out on the West Coast.
Okay.
Red Sox are such piety for his life. He can't even talk about it.
No idea. Coming up, Margaret Patel, Wells Fargo Asset Management Senior Portfolio Manager. Looking forward to that conversation. Going into that, bond yields unchanged.
Some more tang.
161.82. Equity futures up 21. We advance 0.5%. 41.73. From New York City, this is Bloomberg.
Lumber prices across the U.S. are skyrocketing. A 60% surge this year sent prices to a record. And analysts, they aren't expecting any relief until late 2021.
If you can get your hands on it, you're going to buy it, no matter what the number is. And the numbers are getting higher and higher.
Tightness is acute across the entire timber supply chain. Sawmills have had trouble ramping up fast enough to meet demand, while trucking delays and worker shortages at lumber yards have added to the cost. The summer peak of U.S. home building is expected to deepen these supply constraints and keep home prices red hot.
What's happening is lumber's going up, insulation's going up, stucco's going up, concrete's going up, and that's getting passed on to the consumer.
According to the National Association of Home Builders, wood costs have already added more than $24,000 to the price of the average new house. Lumber prices are expected to stay elevated for months to come.
BSO Now is your online home for brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. Discover new releases each week that include behind-the-scenes storytelling with conductors including music director Andres Nelsons, guest composers and musicians, plus critically acclaimed archival concerts and more. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
Expect clear, concise conversation on Bloomberg Surveillance.
There's no vowels in a digital future.
Come on, John, I just think it works.
It works. We're beating
this to death.
Watch weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Monday morning, here's the price action. Good morning to you all. Equity futures up about 21 points on the S&P. We advance 0.5%, advancing 0.6% on the Nasdaq. Some relative outperformance on a tech-heavy Nasdaq 100, a story we've got familiar with over the past week. We bounced back from a week of losses with a small morning of gains. If you switch up the board, into the bond market we go. Ton of Fed speak through today. Governor Brainerd, then we've got Mester, Bostic, George as well on deck as well. So you hear from some Fed presidents too. Going into that yields unchanged at 161.65 on 10s, on 30s, 231.62. That's the Fed speak. Got to talk about the supply as well. 2s, 5s, and the dreaded 7s coming later on this week. We'll talk to Marky Patel, Lisa, about that in just a moment. We need some music to go with the dreaded 7s. We'll do that through the week. Switch up the board and finish on euro dollar. Just want to finish on this. Kick Jukes out this morning, calling it a stalemate for euro dollar. Euro dollar right now.
Well said.
122.14. Well said, Kit Jukes of SocGen. We're up about 1/3 here, Tom. Stronger euro in the mix with a 122 handle again.
Isn't that really a stalemate? Really colors the market here in equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. It's just a churn out there. You're looking for what way to go. The one exception maybe would be green on the screen and equities higher as well. Marty Patel is with us right now. A short visit with Wells Fargo Asset Management. Margie, I'm absolutely fascinated by taking the middle ground in this time of polarity of cyclicals versus tech and the rest of it. What is it like managing a diversified portfolio to a middle and balanced outcome?
Well, it looks right now as if I think over the next year, growth from all asset classes are going to be pretty muted. Stocks maybe mid-single digit, high single digit, and with bonds really mid to low single digits. So we're looking for pretty much muted return, and a lot of the volatility we're seeing we think is just short-term meaningless churning and not really giving you insight into where the market's going to head.
Marky, when you look through the bond yield curve, 2s out to 30s, what I've identified every time we get a data miss, a data surprise to the upside, to the downside, seem to get a lot more movement in the belly of the curve, 5s in and around 7s too. Why is that, Marky? What's the dynamic at play there that there seems to be a big debate on any given data point?
Well, I think because the short end and the long end are both really controlled by the Fed. So the only way you can really express a trading position is in the middle part of the curve. And that's why you see, I particularly like the 10-year because it's now a great sentiment indicator reacting to numbers over the short term, although it's still in the whole middle of the curve, stuck in a trading range.
How would you express that move in the middle of the curve right now then, Marky? How would you express a trade?
Well, I think we're still stuck in the middle of this. I think the market goes up to the top end of the curve when there's maybe negative sentiment, and then they swing back to the lower end or right around where we are now, 1.5 or around 160. So I don't think those rates are going anywhere. I think the Fed has been very clear that they're not going to allow any part of the curve to really get away from them.
Just to channel Margie, Tom Keene, that's the full faith and credit story. What about the credit story, the corporate debt story? We've seen Morgan Stanley come out recently and downgrade their their expectations for corporate credit to neutral because they think that it is priced to perfection in a world with rising rates potentially, as well as perhaps peak growth rates already seen in the recovery.
The peak growth rate, I would definitely agree in. As far as rising rates as a secular trend, I absolutely don't see it. I think we're still stuck in more or less a trading range for the foreseeable future. And it's true, you could say bonds are priced for perfection, but in a way, the world looks pretty perfect. We should have continued economic growth. We should have defaults being very low. Corporations, especially in the U.S., are in great shape. So I don't think you can expect a big rise in defaults, a big jump in volatility. I think it's pretty much more of the same.
What is the least priced in scenario, Margie? And I ask this ahead of Matt Hornbach of Morgan Stanley, who will be on this show talking about how so much inflation has been built in that a lowflation, a disinflationary environment potentially could be one of the bigger risks. What's your view on this?
I think rates are more likely to go lower rather than up, or I don't buy into the inflation story. It would be great. We all know what to do as investors, look at the history books, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I think we have this push up temporarily, then I think it's going to fade. As we see growth fade, still positive in the second half of the year.
Margie, what do you see in conservative stocks when you combine dividend growth with share buyback? Is it traceable, or is it such a one-off right now in a boom economy you can't really develop a trend?
Well, I think you really have to look at industries and company results. I don't think you can really play some of these themes, value growth and so forth. So we try to look for companies that still should have sustainable growth, hopefully better than the economy, better than the average stock, and take the dividend where it comes, whether it's high or low, but rather look at the companies, because dividends are still pretty low. Standard & Poor's is less than 1.4, so you're not going to get a big part of return from dividends anyway.
Are you husbanding cash right now?
No, because I see very low risk in the sense of a big drop in the equity market or a big drop in bond prices, a spike up in yield. So we think you just have to take the market as it comes and sort of look for the best in the bond market, look for the where you can do the best in the equities, and basically stay fully invested. We think the Fed has pretty much told us we aren't going to have any big volatility in the financial markets. They're going to assure us of that, and that I believe.
Margie, thank you. We've got to run. Margie Vitale there, Wells Fargo Asset Management Senior Portfolio Manager. We have to run because we have to find some space to do this, TK. I wasn't aware, otherwise I would have done it earlier. Congratulations to Lisa Abramowitz, who is the proud recipient of a Gracie Award from the Alliance for Women in Media. Lisa winning for her work on the Bloomberg radio special, Generation Interrupted. Lisa, congratulations.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic.
I'm glad you didn't do it earlier because there's plenty else going on in the world.
Well, we waited 36 minutes.
One thing I will say is that on this show and all of the shows on Bloomberg, we've done a really good job of trying to highlight all of the ramifications, which we really won't know for a very long time from the COVID pandemic.
What did we learn on Generation Interrupted, Lisa? And what are we learning since that was published?
Well, it was taking a look at the younger generations, those in school, both, education in the primary grades as well as college and just after, and how the disruption to their career trajectories could have a pretty big impact on their longer-term earnings potential, in addition to social development, and how this is a big concern for economists.
Very cool. TK.
Thanks.
In the presence of greatness.
We are.
With Lisa Williams this morning.
Let's not get carried away.
Well done, Lisa. Well done.
Thank you.
Very good. Right now, with what we observed over the weekend, our team has worked overnight to find the right voices to describe the geography of Europe and the politics of Europe. We start strong on this Monday with Carl Bildt. He's a former Prime Minister of Sweden for an extended time, their Minister of Foreign Affairs. But far more than that, he has applied his public life to the fractured continent, moving from Athens up to Vilnius. His work in Kosovo, his work in all of the Balkan states as well is noted. He is European Council on Foreign Relations co-chair. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. There has to be a response, less with the original assertive Belarus and far more from Moscow. What can Europe and European political leaders ask of Mr. Putin this morning?
Well, I mean, you're entirely right. There has to be a very firm answer. This is air piracy. This is banditry. in airspace. And if this is tolerated by Lukashenko, it could happen everywhere in the world. So it's a threat to to the safety and security of global airspace everywhere. So firm action has to be taken. What can be done? Well, I mean, European leaders are meeting this evening in Brussels planned for other issues, needless to say. I think they should declare Belarus airspace unsafe. One should not fly through Belarus airspace because you might be subject to hijacking or God knows what this man is capable of doing. And then, of course, bring it up in the relevant international bodies, ICAO, and probably see what can be done within that context. There might also be a case for wider economic and financial sanctions against Belarus if he doesn't follow the international reaction now. Russia will be supporting of Belarus in this particular action. Right. I don't think that particular thing is nice, but they will be supporting Belarus, yes.
Carl Bildt, you wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs. I'm going to play off of it years ago, in that this event will reveal Belarus, this event will reveal Russia as they treat the Baltic states. We forget these distances, 116 miles from Minsk to Vilnius. It's an hour and 30-minute flight to Stockholm. Describe the closenesses here of the tension, the geography of the tension, along with what this will reveal about these two states.
No, it's very true. Minsk and Vilnius are very close. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the statistics, Belarus is the country in all of the world where you have the highest numbers of Schengen visas relationship to the population. Because Belarus people are normal Europeans. They like to go to shopping in Warsaw or in Vilnius or wherever. But they got this thug, Lukashenko, who's been there forever since the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's been able to consolidate an authoritarian regime. The economy is a sort of Soviet memorial, more or less. I mean, it's dependent upon a couple of huge state-owned enterprises. The economy is miserable, all sorts of deficits. The Russians have to bail them out now and then. And of course, he completely manipulated an election last autumn. And since then, he's been trying to preserve his power by very severe repression against a very decent European nation, which, as you said, is close to us. I mean, Minsk is much closer to Stockholm than Brussels or London is. So it's not a faraway country of which we know nothing. It's nearby, and it concerns us.
Carl, this is the political dilemma, isn't it? How do you punish, how do you sanction the government without isolating the people? How do you do that? What kind of decisions do you make?
Yeah, and the dilemma has also been another one, if you look back on the discussions over the years. If we sanction heavily the Belarus economy, there's a risk of course, the Russians picking up the entire thing. Because Russia, Moscow, has been keen on integrating Belarus even more closely than is the case, and even taking over this particular Belarus enterprises. So that's been a consideration so far. In this particular case, so there's a downside to different sanctions. But I think in this particular case, what is done is so outrageous that the downside of doing nothing is far greater than the downside that is there of these particular sanctions, unfortunately, but that's the case.
Do you sense that Europe is united on how to respond to this?
Too early to tell. I mean, this happened literally hours ago. And I think prime ministers and presidents preparing to go to Brussels are still sort of discussing exactly what to do. But if I see what primarily Lithuania, which is most directly affected, are demanding, they are demanding the closing of Belarus airspace for EU flights. They are demanding the closure of EU airspace for the Belarus state airline. I think the Polish Prime Minister said something along those lines. There's a sort of fairly strong language coming out of Brussels, although no action as of yet. Tony Blinken, Washington has come out and said that the decision-making bodies of the International Civil Aviation Organization must be called in. I think they're still discussing exactly what can be done. This is a rather unique situation. There is no blueprint for how you do it. But I think there is, the Greek Prime Minister has to be said at somewhat greater distance in geography, yeah. But the flight that was hijacked was coming from Athens. The Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis has also been very strong in his language. So something will come out of it.
Carl, in the meantime, the Kremlin has said that this has not disrupted President Vladimir Putin's plan to meet with President Biden of the United States at the summit next month. What would you hope the U.S. response could be or would be to some of this? How much will the U.S., do you expect the U.S. to be working in tandem with Europeans as represented by yourself?
Well, I'm quite certain there will be close coordination across the Atlantic. There have been sort of a statement by Secretary Blinken. There was a very strong statement, by the way, coming out of Senator Menendez, who is sort of chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, together with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committees of the German Parliament and the UK Parliament and a couple of other parliaments. And they were calling for strong measures and they were calling for transatlantic coordination. I think that will happen. I think we'll see EU and the US working together, and the UK working together on this.
Carl, who is the center of power when it comes to determining the response of Europe to Belarus, as well as, frankly, to Russia, which seems to be supporting Belarus's actions?
I think it's going to be Brussels, also because of the fact that by coincidence, the heads of state and government are meeting in Brussels tonight, this evening, and tomorrow. So you'll have all of the decision-making power of the EU at one spot this evening and tomorrow. So that I think will be decisive. And then obviously talking to London, obviously talking to Washington.
I need to go back, Prime Minister, to the linkage here of Moscow and Minsk. I mean, obviously, we're going to treat Belarus separately here. There'll be outrage and action as well. How does NATO, how does Brussels link Moscow into their actions?
I think NATO will probably sort of stay on the sidelines. This is not a sort of a military issue, and I don't think we would like it to become a military issue either, by the way. But the role of Moscow is going to be important. I think it's important for Brussels and Washington to send a clear message to Russia that we see this as an infringement upon international rules that are of importance to Russia as well. And we would expect them to not necessarily support us. I don't think they will do that, but to stay calm when action is taking against Lukashenko.
Carl, we've got to leave it there. Fantastic to catch up with you, and what a morning for it. A story that is as much bizarre as it is serious. Very much so. Carl Bildt, the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, sir. The European Summit starting with a pre-summit at 3 p.m. Brussels time, whatever that is, Tom. And then a little bit later, dinner kicking off at 7 p.m. Brussels, won the last 30 seconds. But to Carl's point, when I asked, is Europe united on how to respond to this, he said it's still early. The bottom line is, though, for the airlines, Tom, they've got to operate right now, this morning, through the day, and work out what to do with that airspace.
And Maria, today I was on this looking at the radar maps over Europe, and I've been searching on the Bloomberg for what Lufthansa does and British Air and others. I'm no expert at this as well, but I do agree, John, there's got to be an immediate response. How do you get on a plane and fly over Belarus right now?
No idea. With a lot of nervousness, I imagine. Let's reset and let's get to the equity market. We look like this Monday morning on the S&P 500 up 19. We advance about 0.5%. Tom, yields unchanged, 161.65. Foreign exchange, Kit Jukes over a sock. Jen calling it a stalemate. Euro dollar 122.18. A stronger euro, up about 1/3% there. And just to round things out, just short of a 65 handle on WTI at 64.79. TK, we advanced there by about 1.9%.
And the American recovery advances as well. The pandemic weekend in this New York City was just extraordinary to see. There's just every moment nuances showing the opening of the city. We'll be speaking with one of the mayoral candidates here later this morning. With that, there were essays of what America should do. Joshua Sharfstein, who's at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, their vice dean, and Dr. Sharfstein joins us this morning. Joshua, Scott Galloway, a good friend of the program, had out an important essay this weekend about how the U.S. will project its vaccine excellence abroad. Do we have the supply of vaccines to meet our needs and at the same time really begin to distribute with force to troubled nations?
We can do a lot with the extra vaccines that we have, and we certainly have enough to meet our needs, but it's going to take even more than that because there are so many people in the world and so many people in countries like India where the virus is really running amok. So I think part of the answer is the U.S. manufacturing vaccines for the world, and the other part of the answer is the U.S. being a real team player in building production capacity across the world.
Do you see other nations looking at the best practices of the United Kingdom, New Zealand, the United States, and other nations that seem to have gotten this right? Are they learning from what we've done where they're rapidly catching up?
Well, I think, they may not see it that way. They may not see it as a best practice. They may see it as the United States has vaccines and we want vaccines. I think that certainly we have shown that the mRNA vaccines in the United States and other countries are very, very effective. And that's really what it's going to take to protect countries over the long term. So I think that's a very strong lesson for countries. Certainly the public health measures that countries put into place, and I'm thinking more maybe of some of the East Asian countries, New Zealand, because of its unique geography, had some advantages and has done a tremendous job. Taiwan, all those countries, those have different public health lessons. I think for the United States, it's the investment in vaccines, the ability to vaccinate. Other countries want to do that too.
Joshua, you mentioned India, and it's come out over the weekend that studies show that the main variant there, the B1167 variant that has been spreading very quickly, is potentially 50% more contagious than even the variant that really was first identified in the United Kingdom. What do you make of these studies?
Well, it's an explanation for why we have so many people sick so quickly in India, combined with the fact that they let their guard down and had these major gatherings. And it's a toxic mix that gives you just this astonishingly terrible outbreak right now. There's also evidence that the vaccines do work against this variant, and I think it's even more important for us to really think about the global vaccine supply.
Well, and this raises a question for travel and travel bans, and we see increasingly this sort of patchwork of guidance, particularly in Europe, about countries that are or are not on fly zones and fly lists due to some of the variants. Do you think that this is the right way to go, given how it's been a patchwork of tracking these variants and how ultimately it really just comes down to getting vaccinated, getting fully inoculated, and then gradually adapting to a new life?
I don't think it's going to be really sustainable to be putting on and taking off lots of different travel restrictions, especially when the travel restrictions are so porous. I mean, often the travel restrictions don't apply to citizens of your own country, understandably, but then they certainly can get infected and bring the virus in. So I think that, vaccination, particularly with the evidence that the vaccination does work against variants, really has to be the bedrock of a control strategy.
We've got headlines, Joshua Sharfstein, coming out right now, and actually this came up with conversation this weekend. The idea of the overlay of pneumonia on all of this virus pain that we've had. Pneumonia is a bacterium, and of course COVID is a virus. The headline is Pfizer is studying a pneumococcal conjugate with COVID-19 booster. That's fascinating to me. Is the next step here some kind of virus-bacterium combination of a vaccine?
Well, I haven't read that, but I know not enough people are vaccinated against pneumococcus, and maybe it's a way to combine both. If you're interested in not dying of a lung disease, then getting both of those is a good thing. And so, I could see the logic. Obviously, there'll be some extra study needed to make sure that those both can be immunogenic if they're given at the same time.
What should our viewers and our listeners do if they observe cases coming down in the vicinity of 20,000, deaths per day well under 1,000 in America? How should we interpret that?
Well, just like the virus can go up exponentially, it can go down exponentially. We're on the best part of the curve right now as it's continuing to decline, and that makes everything that we're doing safer. It gives people more confidence in doing things they hadn't done before. That's all good. However, and I talked to Justin Lessler, a professor at the School of Public Health, about this last week. What modeling is consistently showing is that even though it's going to go down, it could well go up in the fall. And the single most important factor to keep us from another fall surge is the vaccination rate. So let's say the vaccination rate is 60%, 65%, and the cases are going down. That is not mission accomplished. If we can get it to 75, 80 before the fall, then we're really cutting off the ability of the virus to have a bigger surge in the fall.
Joshua, at the same time, there is a social implication from continuing some of the restrictions and social distancing. I was reading an article over the weekend about opioid overdoses and how they've skyrocketed over the past 14 months, people in isolation, drug abuse issues becoming even more prevalent. There is a health impact to continuing the social isolation by some of these policies. Is it time, as Amish Adalja has put out there, to start moving into a post-COVID world, a post-pandemic world, where COVID is just another virus that we deal with akin to the flu, and that people who have gotten vaccinated will be somewhat protected, and those who have not, it's their liability?
So 2 points. First of all, with respect to opioid overdoses and many of the consequences, I think it's a mistake to think of these as consequences of the response. We had a global pandemic that kept people, isolated, and that happened regardless of the response that was going to happen, or we were going to have incredible death rates from the virus. Now that that has gone down, absolutely, there are new opportunities to provide treatment. My wife runs as a medical director of an addiction treatment program. They kept going and expanded different services during the pandemic. And it's really important for governments to turn their attention to this, for people to have the same urgency for that crisis that they had for COVID. And that will manifest itself in many ways. And it's very, very important right now. I think to Dr. Adalja's point, we are not there yet. If we can get vaccination rate up, we can have 30 or 70 deaths a week from COVID, which might be, a manageable amount, instead of 2,500. That's what the models show is possible by the fall. So, I am not ready, and I disagree with him if what he is saying is that it's time for us to just, move on to other things. We need to keep our focus, vaccinate against COVID, and prevent a resurgence that could claim thousands and thousands of lives this fall.
Some division there. Joshua Shafstein, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Vice Dean. Thank you, sir. Just want to turn some research on the South Side. We have a move, a cut of Moffett-Nathanson on Discovery, Tom, to neutral from buy. From Moffett-Nathanson, they say we give high marks to Discovery for the boldness of their action and the long-term value creation that could be HBO Max. It also appears likely the Discovery stock will be stuck over the near term.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise at all to me to see them take it down to a neutral. Neutral's not sell.
It's not. In the middle, Tom, between buy and sell. Hold. Do nothing. Neutral.
Thank you, John.
Coming up, Matt Hornback. Neutral's not sell. Morgan Stanley's Matt Hornback up shortly.
It's not their single best idea.
I imagine it's not on their high conviction list.
High conviction.
traffic. Okay. During the pandemic, no traffic at all.
Okay, where do you see the oil market in about 20 years or so?
Non-existent.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad, that we are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
Economists and everyone, companies are having a really difficult time keeping up with how fast fundamentals are improving.
What we're seeing in the U.S. is just a very rapid rebound in demand, and supply is taking a little bit of time to adjust.
If the economy stays as strong as it is, fueled by all of the stimulus that was put behind it, you get inflation.
We see a decent amount of risk that inflation could keep rising. It's already rising, but stay higher for longer.
The Fed strategy at the moment is really focused on ambiguity.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York City for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Monday morning, equity futures up 0.5%. We advance 20 points on the S&P 500. And we begin with the most bizarre story yet incredibly serious. The United States calling for the immediate release of a journalist arrested after the forced grounding of a Ryanair flight in Belarus, Tom, under what is widely considered now to be under false pretenses.
And we did not consider this Friday. Our Guy Johnson and Maria Tadeo both watching Ryanair 3340. John, I know you've taken this numerous times from Cyprus up to Tallinn, Finland, and it has gone over Belarus airspace. It's now just on it's on the border of Latvia and Estonia where it will land. But that's what we've come down to, John. We're looking at the airspaces of Ukraine and to the north, Belarus.
And the next move from the EU, Tom, with that summit kicking off a little bit later this afternoon.
Yeah, well, the summit is a key deal. But again, I go back to what we did with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. I want to know what the reaction is to Moscow as much as I want to know the reaction to Minsk.
You alluded to this question, Lisa. How do you punish the government without isolating the people and pushing the country further towards Russia?
Yeah, and who is going to have the center of power? I am curious to know that. Brussels very much, Carl Bildt was saying, will have the center of power most likely with their pre-meeting today at 3 p.m. I also want to know, though, John, what is the collaboration between the U.S. and Europe? How closely are they aligned as President Biden tries to reestablish some of these ties?
Well, Tom, as you pointed out, that visit next month changed a little bit this morning and over the weekend.
It's got to change. The ramifications are profound. We're looking for other airlines to come out across the Bloomberg. They have not. You've got to believe they're waiting. John, did you say it's a pre-summit?
A pre-summit. There was a pre-summit preamble, and then there was a dinner a little bit later. This is according to Maria Tadeo, who I rely on. Our reporter, our correspondent over in Brussels, Tom.
Well, this is unusual. And again, as Carl Bildt mentioned, does this every nation for itself working in concert, or is it about Brussels? And, you know, this is going to be an original moment.
Finding unity in Brussels is often its own challenge. That's the political story, the big event over the weekend. Right now, the price action this Monday shaping up as follows on the S&P. We advance. We're up about 20 points on the S&P 500, a lift after we were crushed last week. We weren't at all. We're up about 0.5% on the S&P, and the bond market yields unchanged, 161.65 on 10s. Euro dollar, Lisa, positive about 0.25%. That's a stronger euro there, 122.13.
Yeah, well, we've been having pretty muted price action within the major indexes, yet not so much in the Bitcoin world. You could see this $2 trillion crypto asset class has been whipsawed over the past few sessions based on what's going on with China and guidance around crypto assets, as well as just some of the froth being taken out of the markets. This will be the subject of a crypto asset conference held this today and this week. Consensus is hosting it. Lael Brainerd is going to be speaking, Fed Governor, at 9 a.m. and Ray Dalio of Bridgewater speaking at 9:30 a.m. today. 12 p.m. talking about froth in markets, increasing concern that some of the froth in the SPAC world is also continuing to come off, with more companies opting not to raise money through that vehicle. The House Financial Services Committee will be holding a hearing on both SPACs as well as direct listings, investor protections, at a time when people are worried that possibly some normalization of Fed policy could lead to perhaps some disruptions in these markets. And then today, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is going to be heading to Micron Technology in Virginia, talking about the chip shortage. Again, how quickly can the U.S. to shore up chip supplies at a time when the amount of the lag time between when you order a chip and you get it has surged to a record, John?
Three of the things to watch through the day. Lisa, thank you. Through the week, 2-year notes come to you tomorrow from the Treasury. 5-year notes coming shortly thereafterwards, a day later. And then after that, we get the dreaded, Lisa with the sound effects, the 7-year notes coming a little bit later, which seems to have delivered some weakness again and again, Lisa, over the last several months, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone totally understands exactly why, except that it has to do with dealer positioning and convexity and a whole bunch of other issues. But nonetheless, it has been a key marker of just how much pushback there could be. Vigilantes, something like that.
Back in the bond market.
Maybe.
Maybe not.
That's a little bit of an exaggeration.
Tom's grumbling. I don't know about that, TK. The vigilantes making a comeback.
The iron ore vigilantes are out in force.
Yeah, big time.
Singapore's eased back a little bit today.
Matt Hornback with us now.
Have I ever met a vigilante?
Tang vigilante.
Yeah, perhaps. Morgan Stanley's head of global macro strategy.
Thank you, John.
Matt Hornback, good to catch up with you, sir.
Forward.
If you start every day with the same story and it becomes boring, is there information in that as a market participant?
Well, hey, thanks, John, for having me. Look, I've been speaking with bond market vigilantes since the start of my career in Tokyo, Japan. And look, I mean, I think the same news story has been filtering through my feed since June of 2000, which is when I started at Morgan Stanley. No, I mean, I don't think it offers much value to keep focusing on the same thing over and over again. You really need to try to analyze what's new about the situation and how that might change the future.
Matt Hornback, good morning. Tom Keene in New York. What should we do today? We have money to spend. We're not going to enjoy the equity market. What is the application you would do today in the bond space, as they say?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, look, when you have money to put to work in the bond market, you know, the question is always, am I going to be investing this money right ahead of a 25 basis point move higher in yield? Because obviously, if that's coming to you, then you want to wait. But unfortunately, we just haven't had that type of move of late. So what we're advising clients to do is to take the money that they have and put it to work in the highest value add sectors of the bond market, which we see to be in the intermediate sector. So that 5, 6, 7-year sector, you guys were joking about the 7-year note auction coming up. We think that is a good place to putting some money today. It offers the most carry and roll down on the curve. And ultimately, time is your friend here. You want to take advantage of that by putting the money to work in those sectors that offer you the highest carry and roll down.
Matt, I got to say, I want to go back to you saying you've been talking to bond vigilantes for decades now, and perhaps they have not been right is the generous way of putting it. There is this feeling that all these people calling for inflation are misguided. They should take a lesson from history, and yet history is different this time around. You have not only a Federal Reserve that is keeping rates lower for longer and tolerating more inflation, but you also have the fiscal impulse here. You have fiscal spending. What do you say to investors who present that reality to you and say, look, this time is different?
Yeah, Lisa, I mean, it's true. This time is different. We have a completely different monetary policy environment, a completely different fiscal policy environment than we're used to. And so as a result, prices are going to go up more over the next year than we've seen in quite some time. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever about that reality. You know, the question, though, for the bond market is, what about the years beyond that? You know, can we really be confident that we're going to have the same fiscal policy environment, the same monetary policy environment? Bear in mind, Lisa, that at the end of 2022, we have a very consequential midterm election that could change some of the politics in the country. And we also, at the beginning of 2022, we have a situation where both Fed Chair Powell and Vice Chair Clarida have terms that are expiring. It's not clear what the Biden administration is going to end up doing in that regard. So not that that will completely change monetary policy from the Fed, of course, but I mean, there certainly are room for them to make adjustments on the margin that could have a different effect on the market.
Matt, we're burying the lead here, and we've been talking for 5 minutes, so let's just get straight to the issue for you and the team at Morgan Stanley. Right now, your 10-year is at 161, 162. You've got a base case, a central forecast, which is a move towards 180. You've got a more bearish view, and you've got a more bullish view down towards 150 on a US 10-year yield. And what I've sensed from you talking now on and off for the last several weeks or so, Matt, is you think the inflation story is fully priced and a balance of risk is tilting towards that bull case for treasuries. Is the bull case starting to become the base case for you and the team?
Yeah, John, I mean, you're absolutely right. Our skew is towards lower yields. I wouldn't say we're yet ready to capitulate on that, in the sense that we still think interest rates are moving higher gradually. Of course, the base case from Chetan Aya and Ellen Zentner, our chief global and U.S. economists, is that the environment is going to be very conducive to higher interest rates going forward. But there are risks to that base case that are not yet in the price, we think. So to the extent that those risks end up materializing in the next 6 to 12 months, then yes, we probably will have lower interest rates than what we're currently forecasting. We're not ready yet to go there, but at some point, maybe in the next 3 to 6 months, we will be ready. We'll see.
Matt, I can feel it. I'm going to keep you out of trouble, but I can just sense the tension that's starting to emerge over at Morgan Stanley after being on the same page for 12 months. Just the bond bull in Matt Hornbach is just starting to come back with a little bit of a vengeance. You don't have to say anything, Matt. I can just hear it just a little bit.
Speak for you.
Just a little bit.
Okay, that's what he says to me all the time, man.
Matt Hornbach and Morgan Stanley, the head of global macro strategy. Look, it's normal for a research team to have different views. They get together and they put out a base case. And as these risks start to materialize, you have to start wondering whether we start to push the other way. And I go back to how we started this conversation. When you start every day talking about the same thing, and it's no longer surprising to people, at some point, Tom, you have to ask yourself, okay, if it's boring, is that because it's in the price? If everybody's talking about the same thing, is the boat too loaded?
It's a parlor game
on the one side.
I agree, John. And to me, so much of it is this game of, is it in the price, is it not? You know what? We react to the news. You look at the futures today, the NASDAQ leading the way up 0.6%. People are beginning to frame a better economy in the third quarter.
Tom, isn't that the tell, though?
More important.
Isn't that the tell? You said we react to the news. Well, it's how we react to the news. What if we stop reacting to the same news we've seen continuously
then
for the last several weeks?
It'll be the pendulum of zombies.
Of zombies?
Of zombies.
Okay.
We'll be the zombies.
We'll continue this. Coming up at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, Gene Tenuzzo, Columbia Threadneedle, Deputy Global Head of Fixed Income. Looking forward to that. 41.71 on the S&P. Yields unchanged, 161.65. Alongside Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro, on radio, on TV. After a beautiful weekend in New York City, this is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. Flights are being redirected to avoid Belarusian airspace after the government in Minsk forced a Ryanair plane to land and arrested a journalist on board. The European Union will consider further sanctions against Belarus when its leaders meet in Brussels tonight for the start of a two-day summit. Bloomberg has learned potential measures could include suspending flights over Belarus and banning the country's national airline from landing at EU airports. And shares of Virgin Galactic soaring pre-market trading today after the company founded by British billionaire Richard Branson conducted a test flight to space for the first time in more than 2 years. The VSS Unity flight from New Mexico is seen as a critical step in its path towards commercial service. The success helps put Virgin Galactic back on track for its plans to fly Branson to suborbital space as early as this summer. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan to unlock the economy appears to be on track. Data shows that COVID vaccines are effective against the new variant, first identified in India. Over 60 million shots have now been given, with 72% of adults receiving a first dose. The goal is to fully remove all restrictions by June 21st. And golfer Phil Mickelson won the US PGA Championship Sunday, making him the oldest player ever to win a major tournament. Mickelson, who turns 51 next month, finished 2 strokes ahead of the field, giving him his 6th major title overall. Mickelson won his first major, the Masters, at the age of 33 in 2004. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
We're now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution.
The battery problem may be the biggest unsolved problem in all of technology.
Every time the United States has done great transformative things, there has been a partnership between governments and the private sector.
With a willing partner to ensure competitiveness and draw in investment in the United States, Canada is going to be able to be even more ambitious.
The objective for Glasgow, first and foremost, is to keep that 1.5 degree temperature rise within reach.
The train has left the station. Investors care about it. People who work inside of corporate America care about these issues. And certainly we see that with just the broader community.
There's not enough tax in the world for private sector to pay for all of this. It's going to have to be a public-private partnership.
Question is whether
know, the Republicans will meet the effort that the president is showing. It's a sincere effort to move this country forward, but the president has been very clear. Inaction is not an option.
Cedric Richmond there, the White House senior advisor, speaking to CNN over the weekend. From New York City this morning, good morning, alongside Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Your Monday morning shaping up as follows on the S&P 500, advancing 18 points on the S&P, up by 4, call it 0.5%. Elsewhere in the bond market, 161.82 on 10s were unchanged there too. In euro-dollar land, the euro up about 0.2%. That is a stronger euro, 122.11, reclaiming that 122 handle over the past week. WTI crude just south of 65 at 64.67 and up by about 1.7%. On the negotiations down on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., this from the senator from Maine, the Republican from Maine, Susan Collins. Senator Collins saying negotiations should continue, but it's important to note that there are some fundamental differences here. What is infrastructure? And I mentioned this in a previous ad, Tom. What is infrastructure? We've been asking that question over the last several months, and if we don't have the answer to that, have we really made any progress?
No, the major difference now is the calendar. It's May and not April and not February or March as well. Time is moving on. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to bring to your attention, folks, we're continuing to follow. John, I want you to jump in here because the importance to me is to get out the clock. 6 hours on, it is 1 p.m. on continental Europe. And John, they're getting towards 2 hours from now. We may start to see a lot of announcements.
3 p.m. there will be a meeting. I imagine you'll get some comments from individual leaders over in Europe, which is the EU summit you're alluding to, Tom. Then a little bit later this evening, there'll be a dinner. So what we want to gauge from European leaders, respectively, is where each country stands on what to do, whether every country wants to do something. One, we certainly don't want division there. And then it's the decision of what to do. Is it a package of big, broad-based sanctions, right, Tom, or individual here and there? And I think what it will come down to for many people, and we've sensed that already over the last 24 hours, we've got to do something about the airspace around Belarus, Tom, and whether you can actually travel through it or not.
And I look back and forth with Guy Johnson, and you've got KLM/Air France from Paris to Amsterdam over to Minsk. Will that plane fly? Or maybe Frankfurt nonstop to Minsk later on here. I'm going to say 4 or 5 hours from now. Will that plane fly? The flight we really want to know is, will the infrastructure plane fly in the United States? Emily Wilkins joins us, our Bloomberg infrastructure expert as well. To me, Emily, the arch issue is the calendar. May is done. June is upon us. Now what in this debate?
I mean, Tom, you're absolutely right to point out the calendar here. I mean, in the House, we actually expected to see a markup on some legislation dealing with infrastructure this week. And then last week, we got news that that's going to be delayed until the end of June. In the meantime, Congress has other stuff getting on their calendar. And I think that White House official Cedric Richmond summed it up very well when he said, you know, Biden does want to do this in a bipartisan manner, but they are willing to go it alone. And Democrats have kind of been waiting to get the signal from President Biden on whether they should just start putting together a bill that can try and pass through that budget reconciliation process.
What will be the catalyst this week to get that done? I mean, they're going away for what, a 3-week fact-finding tour with their districts, whatever. I don't mean to make light of it. They got to go home and get the pulse of their constituents. But what happens this week to advance the process?
I think we're going to be looking at those Senate Republicans who Biden has been negotiating with to see if they are any way that they can move forward with that trimmed down $1.7 trillion bill that Biden came back with on Friday. But Tom, that did not get a warm reception from Senate Republicans. They were not excited about the fact that more had been cut. They were still saying there's plenty of stuff in this bill that's not infrastructure and that we don't support. And so there does seem to be a big block there. At the same time, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is putting increasing pressure on President Biden, saying, look, Republicans want to cut all this stuff. We want to deliver it to the taxpayers. We have the votes to do so. We need to move now. And Democrats are also very conscientious of what happened back in 2009 with the Affordable Care Act debate, where they waited and waited and waited for a bipartisanship until it was so late, and that wound up sort of costing them, even though they had to go it alone.
Emily, let's talk about what's actually getting done. We talk about the disagreements, plenty. Let's talk about highways and bridges and tunnels. And there does seem to be some sort of plan to finance these areas of infrastructure in the near term. How quickly could we see that being done, and how much is the headline number here?
Well, we are going ahead and seeing the Senate move ahead with a bipartisan bill on highways. This is something that does need to be reauthorized by the end of September. There's a hard deadline here. Unclear how this legislation might wind up working into a larger package. And of course, Lisa, as you point out, one of the sort of sticking points right now is exactly how to pay for this package, because you're seeing President Biden's tax plan come to Congress and you're seeing that rubber meet the road. Bloomberg reporters speaking with those on the House Ways and Means Committee, the Tax Committee, have said that staffers there are already starting to trim back President Biden's plan and try and make other adjustments to make sure that Democrats can get on board, because moderate Democrats, they know they've got a tough re-election in 2022. They're seeing these giant tax hikes that President Biden is proposing, and they're saying, wait a second here, if these pass, are we going to then lose election come next year?
Just to jump in, Emily, Tom, just to return back to that story of the grounded flight Ryanair jet that was grounded in Belarus. Dan Tannenbaum, our go-to sanctions expert from Oliver Wyman, writing in, he says the following, Tom: sanctions on Belarus have never been effective. They have the coverage from Russia, and Lukashenko and his administration have been sanctioned for over a decade. Goes on to say, though, that EU sanctions have fallen short in the past few years as they require unanimity from the member nations. And this particular situation might actually help that along so they can do something with perhaps a little bit more strength.
Well, it's a strength, but again, it is the linkage to Russia. And Emily Wilkins, this comes back to the United States, perhaps distant in this discussion. What pressure can we apply on Russia to be a distinctive force with a dictator?
I mean, President Biden is going to be meeting soon with Russian President Putin, and they are going to have discussions. I think a lot of what pressure they might apply might depend on what comes out of the European leaders meeting today, on what direction they go in. You have seen the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, call for a ban on all flights in and out of Belarus until an investigation can be done. I expect this is going to be a story that you're going to see a lot more politicians in the U.S. weigh in on today as they wake up and get their Monday started.
Emily Wilkins getting the Monday started early. Thank you. Bloomberg government reporter on the latest with the infrastructure spending plans, the negotiations, and what on earth is happening in Belarus. And Tom, finding unanimity at the European level is sometimes tough, but given what's happened over the weekend, they have to move and have to move hard, because if they don't, you're just opening the door for this kind of thing to happen again repeatedly, and maybe elsewhere too. The reports coming out of Europe, a suggestion that maybe it won't just be the air links that are shut down. It might be the ground links that are shut down as well. Air and ground, both of those, Tom. That would be something.
Yeah, that would be something, particularly on a commercial viability of Belarus. The roads are absolutely key.
Coming up, Neil Shearing, Capital Economics Group chief economist. Looking forward to that from New York City this morning. Good morning, alongside Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Equity futures 41.70 on the S&P 500, up 18 points. We advance 0.4%. Yields unchanged, 161.65 on 10s. Heard on Bloomberg Radio, seen on Bloomberg TV. This Monday morning, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Lumber prices across the U.S. are skyrocketing. A 60% surge this year sent prices to a record. And analysts, they aren't expecting any relief until late 2021.
If you can get your hands on it, you're going to buy it, no matter what the number is. And the numbers are getting higher and higher.
Tightness is acute across the entire timber supply chain. Sawmills have had trouble ramping up fast enough to meet demand, while trucking delays and worker shortages at lumber yards have added to the cost. The summer peak of U.S. home building is expected to deepen these supply constraints and keep home prices red hot.
What's happening is lumber's going up, insulation's going up, stucco's going up, concrete's going up, and that's getting passed on to the consumer.
According to the National Association of Home Builders, wood costs have already added more than $24,000 to the price of the average new house. Lumber prices are expected to stay elevated for months to come.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
From New York City, for our audience worldwide, live on TV and radio, alongside Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Equity futures up 18 points on the S&P 500. That was early, Tom. Usually you interrupt about 20 seconds in, not 5.
I wanted to be
Nasdaq
extra
futures
rude
up
today.
0.6%. Thank you.
It just keeps going.
Thank you. 2 weeks of losses on the S&P 500. It's marginal stuff. A move back, a bounce back on the S&P by about 0.4%. Switch up the board into the bond market, 2s, 10s and 30s. Tom sounds bored, and maybe there's some value in that. Not that you're bored, Tom, just that for the broader story, it's become somewhat boring. You hear about the same thing every single day. So what does that mean? How do you respond to it? And does it mean that the boat is too loaded to the one side of the boat? Matt Hornback of Morgan Stanley, I think that's the guy to watch right now, talking about that maybe a lot of this is already in the price. They've got a bear case, they move towards, say, 2%. They've got a base case, maybe a move towards 180. They've got a bull case, a move back down to 150. The balance of risk is shifting. And when you listen to Matt Hornback and Morgan Stanley, it's starting to nudge you towards the bull case of 150, just a little bit more, towards that area. Right now, 160, 165. And let's finish on this. Switch up the board and get to the surprise index in the United States for the U.S. economy. So what are we looking at here? This is from Bloomberg, our team of economists putting this together over on the Bloomberg terminal, our engineers, our data experts. It is the data relative to expectations. So if you get an upside surprise, a series of upside surprises, you'll see this rip to the upside. That's what you saw in the back half, from the middle to the back half of last year. Expectations just too low. Data kept delivering positive surprise, positive surprise, positive surprise. That story's flipped over the last month or so. Economists, less surprised to the upside, more surprised to the downside. Are expectations too high? And Tom, this is part of the same story for me. Are we getting too familiar, too bored with the same thing we're talking about every single day? Is the market starting to be increasingly positioned for it? Are economists too exuberant about the future, the incoming data? Perhaps, maybe. What does it mean for the market? That's the big story, the big question.
I'm going to expect out into Q3 and even into Q4 and what corporate officers will do, particularly around use of cash. And we do this with the lift this morning. Futures up 17, Dow futures up 97. Watching the VIX at a 20 level. David Wilson joins us right now, Bloomberg stocks editor, with the individual securities moving individually today. David, what do you have?
Well, Virgin Galactic, we might as well start there. Now, the stock's kind of come off its overnight high. Nonetheless, still up 18.5% in early trading. All this coming after a Saturday flight into space from New Mexico. The first time that Virgin Galactic's got a plane into orbit in more than 2 years. So that puts the company closer to a couple of goals. First of all, getting its founder, billionaire Richard Branson, into suborbital space sometime this summer. So you're talking the next few months.
Are they going to get his income statement into suborbital space?
Well, if he's taking it with him, I suppose. The other part of it is being able to sell seats to paying passengers. I mean, ultimately, that's the business of Virgin Galactic. So they have to be able to, make those sales.
Okay, I'll go with that. What else do you have?
Cabot Oil and Gas.
I saw this. Yeah, two little companies.
Well, little. I mean, you're talking about a $7.3 billion all-stock deal in which Cabot shares are being used to combine with Cimarex Energy. Now, this one, it kind of looks more like a merger than your typical deal because each company's investors are going to have about half the stock. Cabot's CEO is going to be the chairman of the combined company. Cimarex's CEO will take on the CEO role. They're going to have 5 directors from each board. So, it looks more like a merger than your typical deal, which they describe as a merger of equals.
David Wilson, thank you so much. Got to leave it there with some important breaking news. John, Lisa Abramowitz hanging all over this story.
Very much so, and I think parents across the city too, and across the state of New York. New York City's mayor, Bill de Blasio, saying the following: all students to be back in school in September. There will be no remote option for learning for public schools in September. De Blasio going on to say that parents, students can visit schools in June. Schools will not offer a remote option to students. Schools will return, Lisa, at 100% capacity this coming September.
This is a huge deal. And just to give you a sense of why this matters, when you have a remote option, often what happens is the kids who decide to go to school, sit there in front of their Zoom at school and just listen to the teacher there because you need to provide both platforms. This has been a highly disruptive year. To know that things will be returning more to normal at a time when even kids 12 to 15 can get vaccinated is a really great step, I gotta say.
You mentioned a little bit earlier on the labour market, Tom, and I think this is important. Lisa alluded to this in the last couple of hours. As we get deeper through summer, as we get to September, September becomes this really important point. It's when the additional unemployment insurance ends. On top of the 21 or so Republican states that have already chosen to do that, that particular supplement will end in September. It's also when you get a full return to school in many places, including New York City. What does that mean for the labour market, for the people that have been held back? Can we meet that demand for labour? Can supply actually meet that demand?
I hate to push the pendulum of cynicism, John, but I'll ask this of Ms. Abramowitz. Lisa, is this just about the teachers' union saying, okay, we'll come back?
I'm not going to weigh in on whether the teachers union is basically behind this, as far as, frankly, the fact that people can get vaccinated. There's plenty of vaccines. So if teachers are concerned about their health and well-being, they can get protection. I think that that has been one of the key measures here. Also, the idea that students could also have the option of vaccination. And this really raises a question, Tom, frankly, of people below the age of 12, when they will be eligible.
Yeah, and just to jump in, Tom, I think it's important to say where these headlines have come from. New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio is on MSNBC this morning. That is a national broadcaster here in the United States of America. And I find that somewhat bizarre that he's chosen a national broadcaster to break news specific to New York City.
It is the collapse of, this is a huge sensitive issue, John. We don't have time for it here, but it is the collapse of local media.
You think it's that or the ego of New York City's mayor?
No. In defense of Mayor de Blasio, the mayor of Miami, the mayor of Dallas, if they want to get the word out, you go on surveillance, you go on Morning Joe, you go on CNN, that's what you do. That's the new reality.
And I would argue that also local policies are increasingly national right now, based on the fact that this is also a piecemeal issue that is being dealt with by local authorities, John.
Personally, I think you should put out a press release. Just my view. Okay. Put out a press release, do a series of interviews after that.
Yeah, well,
I don't disagree.
Okay, let us move on. Neil's sharing with us right now with Capital Economics, our group chief economist. Neil, how have you changed your spreadsheet on output in the last week or so? What's the nuance, the tweak that you've amended?
Well, we've not changed our spreadsheet, but I think what's happened is we've become a bit less nervous, shall we say. We've penciled in 6.5% growth in the United States this year. If you think back to 2 or 3 weeks ago, a number of people were saying 8% growth this year. So we were perhaps slightly nervous that we might undershoot that. I think now the consensus is starting to shift back to our direction. 6.5% growth, still very strong, still would make the US the leader within the advanced economies and would mean that the US is back to its pre-virus size of GDP by pretty much about now, actually. So still good years growth in the US, but just perhaps not quite as strong as some were expecting a few weeks ago.
Neil, what do you make for the calls for tapering a bond purchase program over at the Federal Reserve on incoming inflation data when we have supply side issues that probably have very little to do with anything the Federal Reserve is doing?
I think at the moment, if I was advising the Fed, I'd say just stay the course, because you're right, there are several aspects of this that we just don't know exactly how they're going to shake out at the moment. One is the strength of demand. I think we can be fairly sure that's going to be quite strong given the health of household balance sheets and some of the income data. But it's really about the supply side of the economy that we don't have very much information at the moment. And in particular, the extent to which the pandemic has inflicted temporary damage to supply potential, because you alluded to it earlier, parents are staying at home because their kids are having to stay at home. Maybe some people have decided to take an extended break from the labour market, helped by the fact that unemployment insurance is expanded and that runs through September. And of course, all of the inflation data has been distorted by the pandemic itself. So I think if you're the Fed, you look at the last 10 or 15 years, you think, well, what's the danger here? Over-tightening or providing too much stimulus? I think you hold off for 6 months. You take stock where you are at the end of the year, and you make any decision then.
All right, so taking stock at the end of the year, what would the Fed have to see if you were directing the Fed to start to move toward a tighter monetary policy?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think that they may well send some signals perhaps around Jackson Hole. Let's see. If it were me advising them, I'd say hold off to the end of the year. I think the key thing is you look at the labour market. How quickly is the labour market tightening? And in particular, are we starting to see wage pressures building? Now, wage growth in the US is faster than it is in other developed markets at the moment. Earnings growth around 3% year on year, something like that. So it's pretty healthy, but it's not inconsistent with the inflation target at the moment. So I think if you're the Fed, you're looking at the labour market, you're thinking to the extent you've seen the participation rate drop, how permanent is that? Are we starting to see that manifest itself in severe labour shortages that are likely to be protracted? And what's happening to earnings growth? That's the critical thing. And I think you need evidence of that before you start to move on both tapering and ultimately tightening through higher rates.
Hey, Neil, always good to catch up, sir. As always, Neil Shearing, Capital Economics Group Chief Economist. Just getting some headlines I want to bring to our audience. It comes from Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, calling for cool heads in the jet incident, the grounded Ryanair flight in Belarus. He's speaking with his Greek counterpart this morning, Tom, calling for cool heads as European leaders are set to meet through the afternoon and into the night.
Yeah, and beneath that, John, is another headline coming out, and this is what everyone presumed: the flight captain in action above Minsk, I think to the west of Minsk, and then turned right if you're looking north towards Minsk. He consulted Ryanair management. I mean, John, that's actually a side story right now, but at the same time important.
It's an important story, even if it is a side story. Lisa, these are not decisions we want airlines to have to make.
No.
If you're an airline, you're operating a jet, and you're told about the potential terrorist threat, and they're launching fighter jets to escort you to ground the plane, what on earth do? You probably ground the plane.
Yeah, but you don't want this to become a precedent. And I think that is really the issue when you look at the severe response, or at least the rhetoric coming out of Europe, as well as certain parts of the United States.
It certainly underlines the need for a severe response, that's for sure. Coming up, 8:30 Eastern, Mona Mahajan, Allianz's Global Investors US Investment Strategist. Looking forward to that. Equity futures up 18. We advanced 0.4% on the S&P 500. Your yields coming in almost a basis point now, 161.31. On radio, on TV, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. European leaders will discuss possible sanctions after Belarus ordered a Ryanair flight entering its airspace to land and arrested a journalist on board. The move was an unprecedented violation of European air travel protocols and drew sharp and unified condemnation from the US and the EU. Bloomberg has learned that EU leaders will weigh measures such as travel restrictions and possible flight bans. 3 times this year, major pieces of U.S. infrastructure have failed. First, the Texas power grid, then the East Coast's main gasoline pipeline, then a freeway bridge over the Mississippi River. The crises disrupted businesses and lives, cost billions, and left more than 150 people dead. But President Biden's $1.7 trillion infrastructure package wouldn't necessarily have prevented any of that. Experts say these incidents highlight a flaw in the way the U.S. thinks about and pays for infrastructure. The country focuses more on building new things rather than maintaining what it has. And China is accusing the U.S. of promoting theories that the coronavirus escaped from a high-security lab in Wuhan. China responded today to a new report about sick workers at the facility. The lab has repeatedly denied these claims, including a U.S. State Department report that some researchers became ill as early as the fall of 2019. China calls the claims conspiracy theories created to divert attention from the U.S. government's own handling of the coronavirus. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Countries that entered this crisis with limited fiscal space, with more vulnerabilities, need to be supported for the benefit of the world.
The transparency of the debt burden for the poorest countries needs to be increased. There needs to be fuller disclosure.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash, $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
rising incomes in Asia is going to be the key source of growth over the next 10, 20 years. So I think that's why you're seeing lots of businesses pivoting towards Asia, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
That was Mike Bow there, the JP Morgan Asset Management Global Market Strategist over in Europe, joining us out of London last week, from New York City this morning. Good morning, alongside Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Equity futures up 18. We advance 0.4% to 41.69, just short of 41.70 this morning. Elsewhere in the bond market, yields in about half a basis point to 161.65. Euro dollar, stronger euro dollar 122.12. Euro dollar moving by about 0.25% into the euro's favour. And just finally there, Tom, WTI 64.57, up about 1.5, call it 1.6% into positive territory.
Yeah, it's just a turn to the market, but nevertheless a lift in equities. I do want to point out as well, Maria today are really on top of all of reporting into the afternoon in continental Europe. And John, it is extremely fluid at this moment.
Very much so. And as always, with any European summit, Tom, we have to understand whether there is agreement to do something. It seems like there is. There is unity on that front. The something is what will be debated. And we have to hope there is some unity on that front as well. Though it comes down to pretty basic things on this one. Most people overwhelmingly in the last 24 hours, the consensus view has had to be that we have to do something about the airspace of Belarus.
Ms. Tadeo reports that Mr. Macron is meeting in some form with Gitanas Nausėda of Lithuania, their president of Lithuania at the moment. We will digress, and with the markets where they are, take a moment here to take that wonderful Mike Bell shot. Our team nailed it with that comment you just heard from Mr. Bell of JP Morgan about the growth of Asia. We review this important statement Friday with Enda Curran, our Bloomberg Chief Asia Economics correspondent. And I was really taken by Mike Bell's analysis here of the permanence of growth in Asia. It really is leaping out from the rest of the global economy.
Well, I think it has been the standout performer right through the pandemic, Tom, because of its aggressive and the early control of the coronavirus that allowed the economy, certainly in East Asia especially, to get motoring again pretty quickly. And we've had a fairly aggressive V-shaped rebound in China, of course, and we've had, pretty decent recoveries in the rest of the region too. And the export story is going gangbusters out of East Asia. So there's no doubt that the potential is there, the economic potential remains. But don't forget there is that demographic challenge. We had the census figures out of both China and South Korea in recent weeks, reminding of the challenges there with the aging workforce.
No, maybe not the boom of the tigers of years ago. What are the limits that you observe on the Pacific Rim, and particularly China, of governments jawboning against free market pricing and capitalism?
Well, we're seeing a good example of that at the moment, Tom. China came out today with some pretty tough comments in terms of where it wants commodity prices to head. But the question is, what exactly can the Chinese government do about it? I mean, of course, they can try to perhaps keep a lid on speculation in futures markets in China. But what can they do about the price of commodities that are mined and traded outside of China and reflect global demand? That's the big question. But nonetheless, it does show you that China doesn't, or continues to have suspicions about the markets. It continues to fear the markets when it comes to its own economic development. In fact, and we're seeing now this big run-up in commodity prices concerning China about inflation, concerning about the impact to manufacturers, and they clearly want to try and take whatever steps that they think they can to cool commodity prices.
And in the past, China was the main driver of demand for a lot of these metals, for a lot of the commodities, due to the infrastructure spending. Now you have a China that's reducing some of its credit impulse, that's trying to rein in the cost of some of these projects, that's facing areas that already have been built up. How much does China underpin the global demand for commodities, even now, even with the push for infrastructure spending in the likes of the U.S. and Europe? Or has the pendulum, to use Tom's word, shifted away from China when it comes to demand?
Look, I think it's still a big part of the demand story, Lisa. I mean, we know it's the world's biggest importer of oil, for example. We know that its demand for iron ore is sending iron ore to record prices in recent weeks, and that's a big part of the Australia story, for example. And we know that they still have a very hefty infrastructure program and an urbanization program to fulfill. And the other side, don't forget, their manufacturers, like I mentioned at the start, are really racing to meet global demand at the moment. And they need all of these input materials. They need plastic, they need oil, they need copper, they need aluminium, whatever it is. And in fact, we speak to a lot of manufacturers all the time, and they are the ones who are making the complaints that really these prices now are at decade highs, are starting to impact their own profit margins. And that's why we're seeing China start to make some moves now in terms of what they can do to bring down prices of commodities. So I think China is very much a major spoke in terms of the total global commodity demand story, and that's reflecting both global demand and, of course, reflecting what's happening in China itself.
Getting some breaking news across the Bloomberg terminal from Lithuania to reject flights from Belarus airspace. Lithuania recommending all flights be redirected from Belarus. So there it is, Lithuania making the decision for the Europeans as the rest of Europe's leaders convene over in Brussels later on this afternoon, Tom. Lithuania to reject flights from Belarus airspace. Lithuania recommending all flights be redirected from Belarus.
And this is really important, particularly for our U.S. audience here in the early morning of 8 o'clock Wall Street time. As you move from Estonia to Latvia to Lithuania, you've got three different stories, three different cultures. We have a tendency to lump the Baltic states together, and I learned over a beverage of my choice in Helsinki, John, you don't do that.
You don't do that, and we won't do that this morning.
Yes, we will not.
Lisa, just to respond to this, just to reiterate the headlines that cross the Bloomberg right now. Coming from Lithuania to reject flights from Belarus airspace, they go on to say they recommend all flights be redirected from Belarus.
Yeah, the idea here being that there needs to be a strong response, particularly by airlines, by nations, in order to prevent this from happening again. And frankly, it puts a big highlight on international relations ahead of the summit, the pre-summit happening today at 3 p.m.
And Curran, got to leave it there, sir. Our Chief Asia Economics Correspondent joining us out of Hong Kong. Enda, thank you. Just to reiterate the news over the weekend then, if you haven't heard about it, where have you been? A Ryanair jet forced to ground the flight in Belarus on its way to Lithuania under what is widely considered to be, Tom, under the false pretenses of a terrorist threat, grounded, and a journalist was subsequently arrested. Not good, and now it's about the Europeans responding.
And as we mentioned with Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Stockholm, it is stunning, John, at least for me, the closeness of these tensions. The geographic distance can't be underestimated. 116 miles from Minsk up to the northwest to Vilnius.
Just some value add from Guy Johnson, our colleague over in London, Tom, who follows the airlines closer than me, that's for sure. Goes on to say that most flights from Moscow don't use Lithuanian airspace. Just putting that one out there.
I also think it's interesting, the timing, the idea that this is coming out at a time when people are finally feeling confident to get back on airplanes, right? I mean, you don't want to have a dent in confidence that something like this could happen at a time when people finally can get out of their homes and get out of their countries.
Coming up, we'll catch up with Gene Tenuso, the Columbia Threadneedle Global Head of Fixed Income. I demoted him a little bit earlier this morning, called him the Deputy Head. He is the Global Head. That is my fault, Gene, and I'm pleased to say he's still joining us. 41.70 on the S&P 500, up 19 points. We advance 0.5%.
After bribing him.
Not the first, won't be the last time.
I've never done that in my life.
Yeah, right. This is Bloomberg.
closures and the complexities of COVID, it became apparent that if we could provide this course in South Australia, it would benefit trainees of anaesthesia in the state.
I feel like I've got some excellent skills to take away from the course, and I'm very grateful that it could be run in Adelaide.
BSO Now is your online home for brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. Discover new releases each week that include behind-the-scenes storytelling with conductors including music director Andres Nelsons, guest composers and musicians, plus critically acclaimed archival concerts and more. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
See a decent amount of risk that inflation could keep rising. It's already rising, but stay higher for longer.
What we're seeing in the U.S. is just a very rapid rebound in demand, and supply is taking a little bit of time to adjust.
The Fed's strategy at the moment is really focused on ambiguity.
The idea here is that the Fed is going to be behind the curve when they do start to tighten the process.
I don't think those rates are going anywhere. I think the Fed has been very clear that they're not going to allow any part of the curve to really get away from them. This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene, a simulcast. We say good morning to all of you in continental Europe on the precipice of international negotiations over sanctions to Belarus. Futures up 19, Dow futures up 107. But, John, right now, it's beginning, let's do the time frame, John, 8 a.m. in New York, which means 7 hours forward is 3 p.m. In Vilnius, in Minsk as well. And Lithuania speaks in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, preamble. A get-together of European leaders, and what a timely one, because this tops the agenda now. Lithuania set to reject flights from Belarus airspace and recommending that others do the same, I'm sure. And that's got to be top of mind going into this meeting. What will they do? How will they sanction Belarus? And top of mind, I think, for most people, Tom, including us on this program, is what do they do about the airspace over that country?
The airspace will be fixed quickly here with flights scheduled this afternoon. I saw some on Lufthansa. I saw some on KLM. John, from the Prime Minister of Lithuania, Ms. Simonetta, can't comment on possible Russian involvement. You know that's got to be coming after we figure out the airlines.
Absolutely. But the biggest challenge, and Lisa alluded to it a couple of hours ago, is how do you sanction the government without isolating the people and pushing this country further towards Russia? That is always the ultimate dilemma for the Europeans, Tom, and that's the ultimate dilemma this morning too.
No, that comes down to, Lisa, the sanctions have value. I mean, Dan Tannenbaum writing into John Farrell here in the last hour. I mean, this is a serious issue. If you have sanctions, you got to do them, don't you?
Well, there's different kinds of sanctions, and I think that the ones that are being proposed by European leaders of not even allowing ground travel, let alone allowing Belarus planes to land in their countries, will have a real impact on the citizens. Look, it is interesting to me to see this heating up before Joe Biden heads over to Europe to have his summits to really try to integrate the U.S. policy with the European leaders. I am interested to see how this turbocharges some of those efforts.
Well, we'll keep you abreast of this. this morning. Our Guy Johnson, of course, with airline expertise, watching carefully. CDG out to Delhi, that's going over Belarus right now. So it's John, I think we could state internationally on the continent of Europe, it's business as usual for air travel.
At least
right
so
now.
far, but I think this is a really tough time for the airlines. And you mentioned Guy, and I've been catching up with Guy as he prepares for the show a little bit later this afternoon, pointing out that most of the traffic above Belarus goes to Moscow, but they fly Poland to Belarus and don't go into Lithuanian airspace. So if the EU do this, the flight times, the fuel, the costs for the airlines, they start to build pretty quickly around this issue.
Let's get to the markets right now before we discuss fixed income. John, I'm seeing a massively range-bound market with one exception, which is equities have put it on the last couple days.
Breaking out, NASDAQ 100 up another 0.7%. That's where some of the outperformance has been, and that's where it is right now this morning. That's the NASDAQ 100. The S&P, Tom, up 20, advancing about 0.5%. To your point about the everything else, euro dollar, a little bit firmer on the euro side, 122. 10-year, basically unchanged. You could call it coming in a basis point or so, 161.48 on a US 10-year. That's your yield, Tom.
Some economic data this week as well, as we have a full 5-day week. Let's do this. Let's dash right now to our guest to reframe where we are on fixed income. Gene Tenuzzo is with Columbia Threadneedle and their global head of fixed income, and he joins us right now. Gene, what is the single distinction in your research right now? You can look at the factors like duration, convexity, credit quality, and such. What's the thing that matters right now?
Yeah, I think the thing that matters right now, Tom, is the way these inflation pressures are infecting long-term expectations of market yields. Right. And so we know that there are short-term inflation pressures. And the question is, are they transitory? The Fed mentioned the word transitory 8 times in the minutes that we just read last week. That was compared to 2 times in the minutes from the March meeting. So, is that going to be the case? When we talk to companies, and our analysts are talking to companies every day, we're definitely seeing not only cost input pressure, but in some industries, wage pressure. And we think, or the companies are telling us, that a lot of that will be temporary and it'll be over in September when the economy is more normalized, when kids are back in school, when employees are back in office. But that's the biggest area of ambiguity at this stage.
Gene, can we talk about the pain trade? What would exert the maximum amount of pain on the most amount of people? Now, I'm trying to understand, is that high yields or lower yields from here? Which one is it?
Yeah, I actually think it might be lower yields. I think the market is probably positioned, now that we just had the worst quarter for the bond market in about 40 years in the first quarter of this year, with the U.S. aggregate printing a very negative return, we have a fairly crowded positioned for higher yields. Higher yields seem very plausible because the economy is accelerating. We're having this inflation conversation. We're talking about when will the Fed taper. But in terms of a crowded trade, there could be folks that are well positioned for higher yields, and the main trade could actually be those yields going low.
Which is the reason why Matt Hornbach of Morgan Stanley, who came on earlier, was saying that perhaps the balance of risks is now getting skewed a little bit, and that actually the risk reward of betting on lower yields may start to look a little more attractive based on the idea that it is not priced into the markets. Do you agree? I mean, is it worth adding duration, for example, to get ahead of whatever could potentially be a pain trade?
I think it's the right question to ask, but my conclusion is I think that's getting a little bit too cute. I think there'll be a period of consolidation here, and frankly, we've seen for the last 2 months that yields have been more or less range-bound. But to me, I think we will be getting into this conversation as we get into the fall, perhaps Jackson Hole or September Fed meeting, in terms of talking about tapering the balance sheet and then actually delivering that tapering in early 22. I think those pressures continue to put upward forces on yields.
What is your treatment of all the cash that is out there? There was 1, 2, 3, maybe I've seen 4 analyses of $700 billion of cash in different guises that's out there. How do you, as a conservative, buy-side, fixed income guy, treat that?
Yeah, I like to look at it, Tom, as a flow rather than a stock effect. I think when you just look at the aggregate amount, you can get overwhelmed by what seems like a large number of cash. But if you look at, for example, the influx of new asset purchases from the largest central banks, including China and the US and Fed and the ECB, et cetera, what you see is that we're kind of at the point of maximum liquidity right now. And actually, a year from now, that liquidity is likely going to be waning. The Fed will be likely tapering at some point within the 12-month window. The ECB, even though they promised to ramp up their purchases under the PEP program, that's been pretty underwhelming, to be honest. So I think a year from now, that's going to be coming down. And even though it feels like, and we can observe a lot of liquidity in the markets today, I think that pressure will actually be coming off within the investable horizon.
Gene, just quickly, why is the Fed buying mortgage-backed securities? Why are they doing that?
It's just part of a broader program. If the market doesn't need it, we can see that, mortgage option-adjusted spreads or risk premiums are exceptionally tight due to the Fed's involvement. And I think that's something that, in fact, might be at the front end of their taper program, because the mortgage market certainly doesn't need extra help.
Oh, Gene, that's interesting. Just in terms of sequencing, you think they could start there and leave the Treasury portion?
I think it's possible. We have to think about the total construct of what they're doing and how it influences the market. Treasuries are always something that's a little bit more endogenous to their toolkit, and so I think it's easier to sort of exit more agency mortgages first. But quite honestly, I think it's going to depend on the situation at the time. And as I said, I think we're still probably 3 months before we even have the first, until we're talking about tapering.
I'll see you in August then, Gene. Thank you, sir.
Sounds good.
Gene Tenuso, Columbia Threadneedle Global Head of Fixed Income. Staring down Jackson Hole and maybe some changes coming at the back end of August. Just some headlines on Secretary Yellen, the former Federal Reserve Chair, to attend the London G7 in the first overseas trip for the Treasury Secretary to show a commitment to the global recovery, the G7, on June 4th, Tom, and June 5th.
I could see the three of us over there on the lawn at Westminster.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Representing,
I'm not sure what the quarantine rules are, Tom, going from New York over to London, but that would be fun.
Seriously, John, do you think there'll still be quarantine rules into June?
The EU seems to have its own set of policies on how they're going to open up for the summer, and the UK is going with its traffic light system. So the confusing part for many people in the UK right now is, even if you have a country with a green light, it's not necessarily a green light for you to come in. For instance, Australia might be on the green light list, but can you get into Australia from the UK right now, just as one example?
Yeah, I'm absolutely baffled by it. I'll be honest.
Well, you're not alone, Tom.
I looked this weekend at I do not understand the pandemic response of the United Kingdom. It's not that I think it's wrong. I just simply don't understand it.
Well, Tom, there's many things that I don't understand either, and this is one of them. And Lisa, when it comes to being vaccinated, if you have been vaccinated now, how are we in a position where we still have these travel restrictions on Europe coming to the United States? There is still a travel ban. There is still a travel ban for people traveling from the UK who aren't residents, permanent residents, citizens of this country, to be able to come from the UK into New York.
I think it highlights the disagreement even among health professionals. And we see it on this show, Joshua Sharfstein versus Amesh Adalja.
The same school.
The same school. And they've both very accomplished doctors, scientists, and the idea that they cannot agree on what the optimal level of vaccination is before we can talk about a post-pandemic reality highlights the issues that we're seeing among public policymakers.
We've got headlines, John, coming out. It's going to be like this, folks, nonstop into this pre-summit and dinner, 6 hours to Warsaw, 7 hours out to Minsk as well. John, I assume you see them there on Poland.
Yeah, Poland calling this an act of state terrorism, going on to say that they will propose halting all flights between the EU and Belarus. This is just the beginning. We'll catch up with Maria Tadeo out of Brussels a little bit later this hour, hopefully. From New York City, staying on top of an incredibly bizarre yet incredibly serious story over the weekend. The forced grounding of a Ryanair flight in Belarus. Futures 41.72 on the S&P 500 alongside Tom Keene. Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Up next, Leslie Vinja-Murray of Chatham House on radio, on TV. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, having a little look at a stormy London. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. Another sign that normalcy is returning to New York City. Mayor Bill de Blasio says all public school students will return to their school buildings in September and that a remote option will not be available. He says reopening the largest school system in the U.S. for more than 1 million students will be crucial to the economic recovery of New York, which had been battered by the pandemic. European leaders will discuss possible sanctions after Belarus ordered a Ryanair flight entering its airspace to land and arrested a journalist on board. The move was an unprecedented violation of European air travel protocols and drew sharp and unified condemnation from the US and the European Union. Bloomberg's learned that the EU leaders will weigh measures such as travel restrictions and possible flight bans. A progressive group has started a campaign to pressure a sitting Supreme Court justice to retire so a Democratic president can replace him. Activists in the group Demand Justice are behind the Breyer Retire campaign, calling for 82-year-old Justice Stephen Breyer to step down. If Breyer does step down, President Biden can appoint his successor whilst he still has a Democratic majority in the Senate, an advantage he may lose after the November 2022 election. And golfer Phil Mickelson won the US PGA Championship Sunday, making him the oldest player ever to win a major tournament. Mickelson, who turns 51 next month, finished 2 strokes ahead of the field, giving him his 6th major title overall. Mickelson won his first major, the Masters, at the age of 33 in 2004. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishka Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
We're now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution.
The battery problem may be the biggest unsolved problem in all of technology.
Every time the United States has done great transformative things, there's been a partnership between government and the private sector.
With a willing partner to ensure competitiveness and draw in investment in the United States, Canada's going to be able to be even more ambitious.
The objective for Glasgow, first and foremost, is to keep that 1.5 degree temperature rise within reach.
The train has left the station. Investors care about it. People who work inside of corporate America care about these issues. And certainly we see that with just the broader community.
There's not enough tax in the world for private sector to pay for all of this. It's going to have to be a public-private partnership.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
piracy. This is banditry in airspace. And if this is tolerated by Lukashenko, it could happen everywhere in the world. So it's a threat to to the safety and security of global airspace everywhere. So firm action has to be taken. What can be done? I think they should declare Belarus airspace unsafe. One should not fly through Belarus airspace because you might be subject to hijacking, or God knows what this man is capable of doing.
It is the story of the moment. That was Carl Bildt there, the European Council on Foreign Relations co-chair from New York City this morning. Good morning. Alongside Tom Keane, Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Here's the price action going into the Monday morning cash open. 1 hour, 12 minutes away. Equity futures up 20. We advance 0.5%. Your bond market comes in about a basis point or so on a 10-year. 161.31. Euro dollar, stronger euro. Weaker dollar here. Euro dollar 122.12. And crude just quickly, just south of 65, 64.46 on WTI. Up about 1.4%, Tom.
Yeah, the VIX comes in. We're going to get a 19 handle, 20.03 on the VIX, a better statistic with a better equity market. There is no other topic this morning. We are thrilled to have the former Prime Minister of Sweden on, Carl Bildt, and now we do better with Leslie Vinjamuri of Chatham House. Yes, she's head of the U.S. and America's program, but from her work at the London School of Economics, a student of Europe and a student of Russia. You put together, Dr. Vinjamuri, for Chatham House recently, an essay on the adventurism of Russia, and to that extent, Belarus as well. Describe the adventurism we've seen this weekend and how Moscow will respond.
Well, this, I guess, is one of the big questions, whether, what role Russia has had in this, either complicity or making it possible. I think, though, that, the incident is just extraordinary. I mean, state-sponsored terrorism, quite possibly. It strikes right at the heart of the democratic rollback that we've seen over the last 15 years, the attacks on journalists, but really Belarus, the country that we've all been watching, the protests on the street and weighing up what role external powers should take. Europe, obviously, but also the United States. And now I think there's it's clearly the case that there needs to be broad and widespread condemnation and tough measures.
Do those tough measures extend from Minsk to the northeast to Moscow? Do we coalesce sanctions in of the two nations, or do we focus on Belarus?
Well, I think there will be a little bit of, what's achievable, what's doable. There's a real concern, as there always is with sanctions. Do they hurt the leadership, or do they hurt the people when it comes to travel? This is clearly going to have a devastating impact on civilians, on people in the country who have already suffered and been on the streets for so long protesting. So I think this is a genuine consideration. Europe is clearly going to be the lead actor on this, but there's a real question of what the United States will do. But Tom, difficult to imagine going back to the days of feeling insecure on airplanes just as international travel is opening up again. The number of concerns now, whether it's spreading the pandemic, now attacks on civilian aircraft. I mean, it really is game-changing potentially. And the international response has got to stand up to that. Otherwise, I think that the potential, even for mimicking this kind of attack, is really quite extraordinary.
And just to give you a sense, Leslie, Maria Tadeo of Bloomberg Television reporting today that Ryanair decided to divert the plane because they were concerned about the plane getting shot down, in line with what happened in 2014 with the MH17 flight, basically saying they opted to divert the flight instead. There is a question going forward of what an escalation looks like, what happens with Russia and where they stand on this. How do you see this playing out from Russia's standpoint?
I think that Russia will be watching this, looking to see what Europe does, looking to see what the United States does, and looking to see quite how far they can push it. Plausible deniability is really the name of the game right now, I think, for Russia on any number of attacks, and this is certainly one. But I think increasingly there will be pressure now. We have, the Biden administration pushing very hard on these questions. There will be pressure to coordinate a response that really condemns this action. Whether there will be success, I think, is is really what we're going to have to wait and see in the next 24 hours.
6 to 10 years ago, the U.S. may have taken a lead role when it comes to coordinating some international response to this. Does the U.S. still have that role, or is President Biden making inroads in actually reestablishing that role for the United States?
Well, you asked the right question, right? Because if we look back even last week to the push for a ceasefire in Israel, Palestine, the quiet diplomacy approach that Biden has taken, holding back on the Security Council, in some instances they've pushed very hard on human rights, on democracy, on international cooperation, and in other instances they're sort of holding back and waiting for others. In this case, it makes sense for Europe to take the lead, but I think that the Biden administration is moving right back into the center of that diplomacy, but still, really tentative in certain spaces where they're wanting to balance that desire to cooperate, to coordinate, depends on who the target is of diplomacy. So a tricky set of calculations, but I think this is the first really big test, arguably, was the conflict, the crisis in Gaza last week, and this really is the next big test. So we will see quite how up front this administration decides to play this.
And Leslie, we sometimes mistakenly view these situations almost exclusively from the Western perspective. What should the West do? What should Europe do? What should America do? As your colleague points out, this is quite the demonstration of power from the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. And I just wonder, from your perspective, when this was initiated, when this plan was executed, they must have known what was coming next. What do you think the goal was of the leader of Belarus?
Well, I think, the recent history, the way that I look at it is that there's been a degree of permissiveness, right? And especially, and I know we don't want to just focus on the West, but I think you can't help but focus on the 4 years when Donald Trump was in charge, giving a pass to any number of dictators and autocrats, and not holding a firm line, wanting to kind of, either emboldening or just staying quiet. And so in the case of Belarus, there's been that kind of permissiveness. And I think,
do you think so, Leslie? Just to come in with the 1 minute we have left, and I apologize, because the previous administration did not sanction this particular election. They did say this was not fair and free. That was Secretary Pompeo himself who said that.
Yeah, but there's a difference between words and taking very tough measures. And I think that it's both the specific case of Belarus, but it's across the globe and any number of instances where the level of turning a blind eye has been really quite extraordinary, and which leads leaders in this instance to think, quite frankly, that they can get away with it. And there are any number of questions about the intelligence failings surrounding this. How did this even happen? The takeoff in Greece, the people tracking this journalist, really extreme failures that the international community is simply going to have to deal with now.
Leslie, always smart and always enjoy your perspective. Thank you for your time this morning. As always, Leslie Vinja-Murray there of Chatham House. From New York City this morning, good morning, with Tom Keene, Lisa Abramowitz, Jonathan Ferro. On radio, on TV, equity futures up 21 on the S&P. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Hello traders, are you ready to trade euro? I'm going to place order to buy euro at 122.097. Okay, so if you're looking to buy euro, here's your chance. You can place an order and stay with me, and we will go until the end of this trade. We will collect profit. I'll let you know, I'll tell you when to sell, when to place stop on profit. Okay, at this moment I'm placing an order to buy euro. I'll speak to you later, guys.
Right now, about half of U.S. households invest. We'd like to get that number up to 95+%. Investing should be as ubiquitous as shopping online. It should just be something that people do.
City for our audience worldwide, live on TV and radio, alongside Tom Keane and Lisa Abravitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg, and here's your price action this Monday, about an hour away from the opening bell. Equities up 21 on the S&P. We advance 0.5%. In the bond market, yields lower by a single basis point to 160.97 on 10s. In euro dollar, 122.12. We're positive there, 0.25%. That right there is a stronger euro. The headlines coming through across the Bloomberg once again. The procedural stuff you might expect, Tom. The EU summoning the ambassador for Belarus. Going to see a lot more of that through the day, and some headlines from respective European leaders on what they would like to see. The Czech leader saying the Belarus plane incident has, quote, signs of state terrorism. That quote, Tom, has been repeated. You've heard that again and again, haven't you? Signs of state terrorism. That's not just something they're throwing around here. I wonder what the implications of using that term actually are.
Well, yeah, and my major focus is on Belarus, and we're seeing those headlines now, and I can't imagine, John, where we'll be in 3 or 4 hours. I'm much more curious about the headlines out of Moscow and the relationship of Europe and the United States to Moscow is the supporter of Belarus. The Bloomberg headline, I think, just simply captures it beautifully. Russia rejects Western outrage.
Let's bring in Maria Tadeo from Brussels, our Bloomberg reporter, who's been helping us along through the morning. Maria, let's just start right here. What are you learning in the last 60 minutes?
Well, Jonathan, what is becoming really clear now is that for European leaders, this is a very serious situation, and it's an aggression that really hits them home. You have to factor here that this is a commercial plane from an Irish company that's going from Athens to Lithuania. These are 2 member states of the European Union, and this is European Union airspace. So this is serious for them. It's almost an attack on the EU. The second thing is that, of course, they know they need to come up with something, and now they're looking at a package of sanctions. They believe that individual sanctions are not going to cut it, and they're looking at ways to isolate Belarus further. So that could be no ban or a ban from flights in and out of the country, but also on the ground. And we're expecting a decision to come in the next 48 hours. Usually it's difficult to get that unanimity from the EU, but this time for them it's different. This is something they look as an attack on the European airspace and a very dangerous precedent.
Maria, Belarus has the GDP of somewhere in the vicinity of Rhode Island. It's tiny, even though it's a large mass. I get that. Tell me right now how Russia fits into this debate with Brussels, but far more with the city-states of Europe.
Well, Tom, it's a tiny country, but geographically it's in a key position, and it's also the only country that is backed up at this point by Vladimir Putin. The reason why Lukashenko is still in power is because Vladimir Putin wants him in there. You know, you have to factor that European leaders have said the election was phony, that he is not democratically elected, and they have rejected his government. The only reason why Lukashenko is still hanging on is because Vladimir Putin wants him there. And that's another thing that I've heard this morning from a number of officials. They say that this could be terrorism terrorism, because what they are trying to do is to send a message of terror to the opposition, to say, wherever you are, we're going to find you and we'll do anything that it takes to get you in a situation that's very difficult, meaning in jail or probably killed too. Maria, how much dissent is there among European leaders in terms of how harsh the actions of their response need to be? Well, you know, usually, and this is the problem with European foreign policy, you have to get 27 different countries, some in Western Europe, others in Eastern Europe, that have different political systems and they have different political interests. But in this case, I would say there is a lot of unanimity on what to do next, which is more sanctions and a very swift, strong response. The question is on the technicalities. What it will also do going forward, and this is a debate that's shaping up, is to essentially send a message that Europe cannot have a normal relationship with Russia. At one point, Emmanuel Macron had been pushing for that, but it's clear that that's not going to happen. And it will put pressure again on Germany to drop the Nord Stream pipeline. How can you have a commercial relationship with Russia when this is happening on the ground, on the political front?
How does this change the meeting next month, Maria, with the president? The meeting in Brussels between the president of the United States and European leaders too.
Well, you know, there's, of course, going to be a discussion over what to do with NATO, over whether or not you need to send more troops into Eastern Europe, and whether or not you have to even, to some extent, just increase and make it very clear that an aggression on a NATO member state will be a serious deal. Again, it will also probably reiterate this message that it's very difficult now to have a normal relationship with Russia. It's just simply not happening. You know, what you've seen over the past year is actually an escalation from the Russian front. So it's very hard to see how you normalize that relationship.
We have to leave it there. Maria Tadeo, thank you so much. An exceptionally busy morning and afternoon in Brussels for Maria Tadeo, and she'll continue to monitor the story. Look to us as we do our best to give you the headlines of the many nations involved. Mona Mahajan joins us right now with Allianz. She's U.S. investment strategist. Mona, it's rude that we've barely talked about the equity markets today. I look at futures up 22, futures up 130. We make a joke about melt up. Are we prepared in a boom economy for a melt up?
You know, look, we've already had a bit of a melt up in the first half of the year, so it's hard for us to think about S&P's up 11% year to date for that to really annualize for another 11%. So we don't necessarily see another melt up happening. You know, keep in mind on a year to date basis, value sectors like energy, financials, you know, parts of the material sector, industrials, all up 30, 20, 15% plus, so well exceeding the S&P return. Where we've really seen the laggards have been that tech and consumer discretionary. And interestingly, as the inflationary pressures started to rise over the last few weeks, we've seen healthcare and staples, sectors that have had pricing power, really come to the forefront as well. So, you know, I think every sector has had its day in the sun. Last year it's been tech, this year it's been the value sectors. Some of the more defensive sectors have risen in inflationary environments. So all sectors have done their part to keep this market steady this year. But as we look towards the next 6 to 12 months, we're really pricing in an environment where maybe growth isn't as strong, although above trend. Maybe the Fed is in play, and maybe there's a different tax regime. So I do think you have to be a little bit more selective, cautious, active as we head towards the second half of the year.
Just getting some headlines across in the Bloomberg, guys, that I want to be very delicate with, very careful with. Comes from Lufthansa, a flight...
Okay, guys, as you can see, position opened for euro at 122.09.7. Let me show you where. And if you manage to open position, stay with me, because in about a few pips, if it will go up, I will place order to sell, stop order, if it will move lower. So let's see, it's already moved lower, so I'll wait until it will go higher. Okay, guys, I'll speak to you later.
4 p.m. in Minsk right now. Remember, it's one time zone over, John, from continental Europe. Warsaw is, I believe, within Europe. And then as you go east, off you go to another 7 hours from New York. And they're going into prime time in Minsk now. This is when, in the afternoon, you fly out to, what, 40, 50 different geographies. So we're coming right into prime time.
And this is when it becomes increasingly difficult and complex for airlines to operate within that country and over that airspace, Tom, because the threat of any kind of terror on an airline is something taken incredibly seriously by airlines the world over.
I agree with that, John. I don't think the airlines are going to stress very hard about this. I mean, these are easy calls to make, maybe not, as Guy Johnson mentioned, CDG to Delhi. I mean, what do you do with that? But yeah, I agree. These are easy decisions for the airlines. It's much more the politics of the moment that will be important. We'll continue to follow this story with us, Mona Mahajan of Allianz as well. Mona, I haven't asked this quaint question in ages. On use of cash, the use of cash has never been greater, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think cash for companies now has been very interesting. Of course, we're seeing certain sectors, for example, the AT&Ts of the world, take their cash and move it away from dividends and into acquisitions. Interestingly, some companies are moving more and more into CapEx spending. What we really want to see to kind of take this economy to through this next leg higher and really kind of continue to drive it is more and more spending in CapEx, in R&D, having more labor enter the workforce and support that as well. And so certainly it'll be interesting for those investors that are looking for dividends to see if those dividends actually do hold. Share buybacks had been a big part of use of cash as well, and we're starting to see that come back as well. So certainly there's been shareholder-friendly uses of cash and then corporation-friendly uses of cash that really drives the economy. That balance may be shifting more back towards the CapEx parts of the world, but we will see in the next 6 to 12 months if that trend holds as well.
Mona, just to tie the idea of incredible cash piles and the dynamism of the U.S. economy and, frankly, the global recovery with this existential threat, this exogenous threat coming from what happened in Belarus, the idea of how fragile are markets right now to some sort of unpredictable threat from the outside. Do you have any sense of that? I mean, the whole concept of price to perfection and people expecting things to keep going on a perfect trajectory.
Yeah, it's a great point. Keep in mind, and we talk about corrections in the market, and any given year, 1 to 3 corrections in the 5 to 10% range are the norm. This year, we haven't yet gotten even 5% plus correction in the S&P 500. And to your point, that we could be set up for at least a period of consolidation after a really nice run, especially across some of these value sectors that we noted. And that could come, what could spark that? Well, we don't know yet, but perhaps it is something in the political regime or in the geopolitical realm that we're seeing coming to the forefront more and more. Keep in mind, in this economy, we've really seen this recovery, and we talk about the K-shaped recovery. There have been haves and have-nots. There has been a diversion in income inequality, and that's certainly the case across countries as well. There's some countries that have really reemerged strongly, and there's certain economies and countries that are still struggling quite a bit. And so in that backdrop, in that environment, when there's this increasing tension between haves and have-nots, there's an increasing percentage or probability that we do see more disruption, perhaps coming from a geopolitical event, or we talked about the terror threats, or just people feeling a little bit more disengaged, disgruntled. And so certainly that's one to keep in mind. Hard to handicap, of course, from a market perspective, but keep in mind we may be due for a little bit more severe of a pullback than even what we saw over the last few weeks.
Mona, I've got to leave it there. Thank you, as always,
Absolutely.
for catching up. Mona,
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you. Mona Mahajan of Allianz there. Some complex, nuanced news flow that deserves the appropriate carefulness and care this morning as we approach some of this news as it comes through. Much more still to come, of course, on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. Equity futures 41.75 on the S&P 500. On radio, on TV, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
With the First Word News, I'm Ritika Gupta. Another sign that normalcy is returning to New York City. Mayor Bill de Blasio says all public school students will return to their school buildings in September and that a remote option will not be available. He says reopening the largest school system in the U.S. for more than 1 million students will be crucial to the economic recovery of New York, which has been battered by the pandemic. European leaders will discuss possible sanctions after Belarus ordered a Ryanair flight entering its airspace to land and arrested a journalist on board. The move was an unprecedented violation of European air travel protocols and drew sharp and unified condemnation from the US and the European Union. Bloomberg has learned that EU leaders will weigh measures such as travel restrictions and possible flight bans. And members of George Floyd's family and others who lost loved ones to police encounters gathered in Minneapolis on Sunday for a march to mark the one-year anniversary of Floyd's death. Hundreds of people joined the rally in front of the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis, where Derek Chauvin's trial concluded a month ago. Many carried signs with pictures of Floyd and other black men killed by police. Tomorrow marks 1 year since Floyd was killed. And golfer Phil Mickelson won the US PGA Championship Sunday, making him the oldest player ever to win a major tournament. Mickelson, who turns 51 next month, finished 2 strokes ahead of the field, giving him his 6th major title overall. Mickelson won his first major, the Masters, at the age of 33 in 2004. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Lumber prices across the U.S. are skyrocketing. A 60% surge this year sent prices to a record. And analysts, they aren't expecting any relief until late 2021.
If you can get your hands on it, you're going to buy it, no matter what the number is. And the numbers are getting higher and higher.
Tightness is acute across the entire timber supply chain. Sawmills have had trouble ramping up fast enough to meet demand, while trucking delays and worker shortages at lumber yards have added to the cost. The summer peak of U.S. home building is expected to deepen these supply constraints and keep home prices red hot.
What's happening is lumber's going up, insulation's going up, stucco's going up, concrete's going up, and that's getting passed on to the consumer.
According to the National Association of Home Builders, wood costs have already added more than $24,000 to the price of the average new house. Lumber prices are expected to stay elevated for months to come.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash, $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Expect clear, concise conversation on Bloomberg Surveillance.
There's no vowels in a digital future.
Come on, John, I just think it works.
It works for inverters.
We've beaten this to death.
Watch weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
We need someone who is a combination of a technocrat who understands how things work, somebody who has the kind of political connections to get resources where those resources are needed. And I think we need someone who is an optimistic cheerleader.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg surveillance, Lisa Bramlett and Tom Keene. An extraordinary morning. We are watching the markets with a lift in the equity markets, and the VIX now under 20, 19.93. But we are focused on the international relations of the continent of Europe. I look, Lisa Bramlett, as the headlines really now in that afternoon when politicians really get going, the headlines stream mercilessly.
Yeah, well, Lufthansa's cooperating with Belarus authorities on the search of that jet that John was mentioning before, that boarding had been stopped. And we are hearing comments from the Minsk airport. I expect this to develop as we've been talking about throughout the day, Tom.
Sweden mentioning, as we spoke to the former Prime Minister Carl Bildt 2 hours ago, Sweden to stop flights over Belarus, that according to one of their news resources. This has been a great joy for us to speak to the different mayoral candidates of New York City. It is widely presumed to be a one-party city. The Democrat mayoral candidates are plenteous. Diana Morales joins us right now. And Diane has a certain voice, a certain approach to this. Is June 23rd is here. Diane, what have you changed in your campaign over the last number of days? What is your new message as you go to the middle of June?
I guess my new message, which isn't really particularly new at all, is that this campaign is actually intended to make sure that our city comes back in a way that we've never existed before, in a way that recognizes our collective interdependence, and in a way that makes it possible for every New Yorker to live in dignity. We haven't quite lived up to the idea of being the greatest city in the world, and this is our moment to seize that opportunity.
We've heard this from other candidates. Frankly, we've seen polarizing candidates and those looking for us out of the pandemic to come together. How do you link that with the budget realities of New York City?
Well, I think the budget realities are that while we won't look like we did in 2019, we're still the wealthiest city in the country, if not the world, and there is enough to go around. And that we've seen throughout the course of the pandemic, from a message of unity, we've seen who it was that kept the city operating. We've seen who it was that made it possible for so many of us to work comfortably from home. And the reality of it is that those are the folks who are also right now the most vulnerable and have been the least protected. And it's a both-and situation. We can actually, make it possible for them to continue in their roles that make it possible for the rest of us to exist, and make it possible for them to live in dignity.
Which raises a question about paying for proposals that will allow people to live in dignity of all income spheres. And the idea here is also that New York City is already a pretty high tax region, and there already has been discussions of ultra high net worth individuals moving to Florida, moving to Arizona, lower tax states. What's the tipping point in your mind for how high tax rates can go before you get this exodus that becomes counterproductive to the overall revenue of the city?
So I guess the first pushback I'll give on that question, or the framing of that question, is the idea of this exodus. I don't think that the numbers actually bear that out to be true. We've seen that in the course of the last 12, 15 months, Wall Street has done just great. We've created more millionaires and more billionaires. And actually the real estate market is on an uptick here in New York City. So I don't think those indicators actually support the idea of a mass exodus. I also think that there's a lot that we can do with what we have. When we look at the resources of the city budget, I think there's a lot of reallocation and reinvestment that we could be doing with the dollars that we do have before we even engage in a conversation about generating additional resources. But I do think that it's also important for us to have that conversation. I think it is fair to ask people to pay their fair share. While we might say that our tax rates are higher than other places in the country, we also have the greatest concentration of mass wealth. So those two things should go hand in hand. And the idea of comparing us to other cities kind of doesn't make sense given the inordinate wealth that we have here to begin with.
Another aspect that a number of mayoral candidates have pointed to that is important to keep businesses here is crime and keeping crime down. A number of people have talked for more police, having a task force perhaps in the subway. What's your view on the best way to bring down crime that has been taking up over the past 14 months?
Sure. I mean, I think that the best way to do that is to recognize the link between the increase in crime rate and the increase in insecurity that New Yorkers have experienced throughout the course of the pandemic. We've allowed for housing insecurity to persist. Food insecurity has only grown. We haven't provided healthcare in the middle of a global pandemic. So, people's individual lives have gotten increasingly insecure. And I think that correlates directly to the increase in violence as people try to figure out how to survive and how to make it in the city. So I think that the first thing that we need to do is to actually make sure that we're providing people with the access to the resources and supports that they need so that they can actually live safely at home.
Ms. Morales, thank you so much. We have to go to the breaking news in Europe. Diane Morales, thank you again, New York City mayoral candidate. Lisa, it is trenchant to see the Bloomberg First Word headline of Lufthansa Flight 1487. The boarding is halted in Minsk. I see it here off my FlightAware as being 2 hours delayed due to a terror threat. But what is so interesting, Lisa, is the sourcing is from the Telegram channel of Belarus, which the gentleman that was detained was part of. It's circuitous.
There is there's also a question of whether they will try to signify that there is this real threat, right? Because the threat that was given from reporting to Ryanair was that there was a bomb threat, which is the reason why they had to be diverted and to land. And the question is there some credence to that threat, or is there going to be the appearance of it? We're just completely speculating. All we know right now is that the Lufthansa flight was halted in terms of its boarding, and the luggage is being searched in Minsk, and this follows that Ryanair flight that was diverted, Tom.
The timing here is 3 p.m. Over in Europe. That is right now in Central Europe into the Eastern Europe. It is 4 p.m. we're coming up on, so we're about at the point of, I guess, pre-conferences and agreements. And Lisa, I would think in the next 6 hours we'll have a lot more to talk about.
And this comes at such a delicate moment, both internationally as well as economically. The idea that people are just starting to fly planes again, are just starting to travel again, and we're starting to see President Biden try to set a new agenda for the United States and prepare for his trip at the summit in Europe. I mean, it's such a perilous moment in some ways, such a crossroads for so many different aspects of the global economy, and this really kind of highlights them all in one swoop.
No doubt we'll have comments from the White House today as well as they wake up here at 9 a.m. Washington time. We wake up to markets, well, they are range bound, but then they're not. The VIX comes in nicely with enthusiasm on the markets. NASDAQ up 0.8%, while S&P 500 up 23 points. The Dow, I'm quoting, John called in from Coventry.
Yeah,
why don't you quote the Dow?
Yeah.
34,292 on the Dow, up 138 points.
He thanks you.
And again, a nice lift to the markets. A balance of power today. A cogent voice on the Republican side, Glenn Hubbard with Columbia Business School. Look for that. Please stay with us on Belarus this morning. This is Bloomberg on radio, on television.
BSO Now is your online home for brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. Discover new releases each week that include behind-the-scenes storytelling with conductors including music director Andres Nelsons, guest composers and musicians, plus critically acclaimed archival concerts and more. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
Global markets never sleep, so stay connected with Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, and Kaylee Lyons in New York. Perspective on the day ahead. Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. Weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
From New York City for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. 30 minutes until the opening bell. Equity futures positive on the S&P by about 0.5%. The countdown to the open starts right now.
Everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. This is Bloomberg, The Open, with Jonathan Ferro.
We begin with a big issue, volatility strengthening its grip on markets.
We're likely to see a bit more volatility. A lot of volatility and noise.
It's going to be more short term. What investors are dealing with is this trifecta.
We're getting these huge surprises.
The market is adjusting to the moves that we're seeing. An upcoming peak in earnings growth.
Massive amount of liquidity, money, and that's feeding its way everywhere.
Higher than expected inflation in premium market multiples.
Asset prices, commodities, and even goods now.
A lot out there, a lot of moving pieces.
Some of the froth in the market may be pulled out, especially with the movement in commodities.
The crypto volatility. That volatility in Bitcoin.
Frankly, this is a fire sale.
It has been exaggerated.
Volatility needs to come down.
We need to get through a couple of these hurdles before we can settle down.
Probably a bit of a dangerous place to be right now.
It's probably a dangerous place to be right now. Joining us is Steve Weinig of Citigroup and Troy Gajewski of Skybridge. Steve, let's start with you, sir. Do you agree with that? It's a dangerous place to be right now. Prepare for some choppiness deeper into summer.
Choppiness in the summer, this is nothing unusual. Perhaps we've forgotten to get used to the fact that we get 3 5% pullbacks per year in an average year, 1 10% pullback in equities in expansion years. So wouldn't hurt for us to have a little bit higher view of the range for markets. So certainly, but we're not beginning a new downturn. We're not going to begin hyperinflation. So let's put those things aside.
Troy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I mean, really since the end of August, early September, John, we've been in more upward trend, but with chop both ways, right? We had the big plunge early in 2020, big rally to the end of August. And since then, we've had several mini corrections along the way. So look, when equity multiples are 21 times and interest rates are trending higher, and you have, a reasonable probability, we think it's low, but certainly the highest it's been since the late 90s of inflation showing up, you're going to have more mark-to-market volatility. But what's your alternative? Cash? Bonds? I mean, Barclays Ag's down close to 3% this year. So you need to selectively take risk and understand that you're going to have more mark-to-market volatility. But that's the price you pay to have an attractive outcome for returns this year.
Would you get paid to work 7 days a week now, Troy, given the weekend price action in crypto? This came from Jared Dillian of Bloomberg Opinion. Jared wrote the following on Twitter. He said, the nice thing about a stock market is that you stop getting your ass kicked at Friday 4 p.m. and it generally doesn't ruin your weekend. Are you getting your weekend spoiled now, Troy?
I'll tell you, man, 24/7 markets will keep you up all the time. But yeah, that's one of the added bonuses of being involved in crypto is you never sleep on weekends. But on a serious note, look, like we've said from the start in this, you have to be ready for multiple pullbacks. And, this is an asset class that if you care about non-correlation, if you care about liquidity, if you care about currency debasement, should have some exposure to. But you just can't be leveraged, right? You can't get blown out in these massive corrections. And unfortunately, you've seen that behavior again.
We'll build on that in a moment. I'm not sure if it's an added bonus or not. Let's bring in Taylor Riggs for more. Morning, Taylor.
John, do I get paid on weekends to cover crypto?
I have no idea. You work that out, Taylor. You do that privately.
Because take a look at the price action yesterday alone. If you take a look at the chart that we're showing in the terminal, it really started last Wednesday, as you know, Wednesday morning when you had price swings of more than 15,000. Then, of course, yesterday alone, you're getting price swings of about 7,000. So you're really hovering here between a $30,000 and a $40,000 range on Bitcoin, really trying to settle out if 30,000 is the floor, 40,000 is the key resistance level at this point. But we are well off the highs of the 50, 60,000 level. What that means is you're well off the highs in terms of market cap. You've peaked with the Coinbase IPO. That's when crypto hit a $2.6 trillion market cap. $1 trillion of that has been taken off now. And I mentioned Coinbase, and this is really interesting because have you found a bottom? Goldman Sachs this morning initiating a buy rating with Coinbase price target at 306. That is the second lowest among analysts, but hey, it's a buy, saying that while the continued success or failure of cryptocurrencies as an asset class, long-term, that's going to determine Coinbase's long-term future. It is a blue chip way to invest in the development of the ecosystem. So notable that Coinbase, of course, is 10 buys, 4 holds, 0 sells, and that is what has been tracking the price, frankly, of Bitcoin.
Taylor looking for a bonus. Now she covers crypto as well. Taylor, thank you. This came from JP Morgan's John Norman in his final note over at JP, and we wish the best to John Norman for the future and wherever he ends up next, and I'm sure there is a good seat waiting for him. John Norman had this to say: if I had to avoid any of the very expensive markets right now, it would be cryptocurrencies because it entails two characteristics other rich markets lack. One, a penchant for high investor leverage, and two, a questionable investment thesis. Troy, I guarantee you'll get your turn. You're just going to have to wait. Steve Whiting, your take on that?
Well, look, I think the one thing that's kind of surprising to me is equating cryptocurrencies with equities. And the idea here is that if we're investing in equities, we're investing in the productive assets of the economy, goods and services that are sold to people. And perhaps cryptocurrencies will be an avenue, will be a denominator, will be the currency in which we have productive assets to invest in that people get. But if it's just going to be a store of value, that it's going to be an intermediary, then it's a currency, even if we want to say that it is more like a commodity or something else. So let's look at it with those characteristics. Let's look at it in terms of adoption and where people want to go with adoption and explain a good deal of the appreciation of it there, the technology, these sorts of things. But when you talk about productive assets of the economy, you're talking about equities, or you're talking about income streams that can come off of that in terms of fixed income, which could, again, develop in terms of crypto as well.
Troy, do you think that's the optimal approach as well?
Well, look, in terms of valuing or analyzing crypto markets, remember, you get back to basics, right? There are alternatives to fiat currencies that have been debased for 30 years. And there are other alternatives to that as well. There's performing real estate, but clearly that's not terribly liquid. You could own copper, but that's on a 100% rally. The key driver, though, is limited supply, right, and growing institutional adoption in particular in an environment where we're still growing M2 at 16%. And back to the point on comparing it to equities, that's one of the keys to the thesis, is that it's differentiated, right? And the correlation properties are different day to day. Yes, can they trade on top of each other in corrections? For sure. But over time, the correlation benefit for a tiny slice of your portfolio, if you assume that the long-term trend continues, is very beneficial.
Troy, you mentioned money supply there. Can you walk me through why money supply is important? From an economist standpoint, they might say it's the velocity of money on top of the money supply that is really important for what happens at the other end, inflation. Why is money supply important to the crypto debate?
Yeah, so step back. If you look at the last 30 years, I'm glad you brought up velocity, because the reason that, or one of many reasons why money supply growth hasn't shown up in real inflation in the economy, is what's happened is really since Greenspan got it started with the long-term capital mini debacle, and then kept policy a little bit too easy going into Y2K, every response of central banks to any market dislocation has been to flood markets in the economy with more liquidity. Now, in classic economic terms, what happens is velocity stays constant, and eventually this shows up in inflation. But operationally, what's transpired, and this is now a 30-year trend, is the money stays in assets. It gets trapped in assets, velocity drops, we never see real economic inflation, but we continue to see currency debasement coupled with asset inflation. And for scarce assets like Bitcoin, where there's only going to be 21 million ever created, and you have new supply halved every 4 years, that sets yourself up for a continuing appreciating trend over time.
Steve Whining, just a final word from you on this issue. Debasement, money supply, etc.
So look, again, asset price inflation and central bank effects, certainly there's a lot to agree with there. Let's remember that inflation is driven by money spending, not money printing, right? If you're talking about consumer goods and services, those prices come from excess demand. We think that inflation will be tilted higher in the next 10 years compared to the last 10 years, but we're in a highly distorted economy right now. The idea that economists predicted 0.2% for the April CPI, and oh my God, we have some big surprise. Take a look at how incredibly distorted we are. We have a massive shift up in goods demand relative to services. Services is not ready to accommodate the recovery that we're going to have in travel and leisure. Those prices are going to jump up. But where we are during this COVID economy for 2020 and 2021, that's going to be a pretty unrepresentative view of where inflation will be in the 5 years that follows. And I think markets are taking some comfort for the fact that fiscal and monetary policymakers are not expecting to repeat this whole thing all over again when we're past this shock.
Steve, stick with us. Steve Whining there of Citi and Troy Gajewski of Skybridge. Got to stay on top of some breaking news this morning. Let's bring in Abigail Dillittle for more. Hey, Abby.
Hi, John. Well, we do, of course, have this extraordinary story developing over the last 24 hours of Belarus forcing down a Ryanair plane on initially what was thought to be a bomb threat, but turned out to be a false bomb threat. The president of Belarus sending a jet fighter to seize that plane and essentially to seize a dissident, Roman Protasevich. He, of course, co-founded Next Telegram channel, popular opposition outlet in Belarus. The plane was flying from Athens to Lithuania when it was stopped in Minsk. They set that fighter jet, as I mentioned. Europe, of course, and the U.S. seeing this as a quote-unquote state hijacking. There's some concern that Belarus, the president of Belarus, has the backing of Putin. And now the latest headline, of course, that a Lufthansa flight was also stopped and that Belarus is cooperating with that at this time. We will stay on top of this, John, as it continues to unfold.
Abby, thank you. Thank you very much. That extra layer of complexity and uncertainty this morning from a Lufthansa flight. The boarding was halted in Minsk due to what's been called a terrorist threat. Flight LH1487 from Minsk to Frankfurt is delayed after the international airport said they received an anonymous email about a planned, quote, terrorist attack. Much more on that still to come. We'll head to Brussels to catch up with Maria Tadeo to get you up to speed on the big story out of Europe over the weekend. From New York City this morning, good morning. With equity futures positive going into the opening bell this Monday, this is Bloomberg.
a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
The real question is whether the Republicans will meet the effort that the president is showing. It's a sincere effort to move this country forward, but the president has been very clear. Inaction is not an option.
Inaction is not an option. Hopes for a bipartisan infrastructure deal deteriorating with the gap between Republicans and Democrats widening. Senator Susan Collins highlighting the growing political divide.
I think we're still pretty far apart, but this is the test. This will determine whether or not we can work together in a bipartisan way on an important issue. And the other important area where we're far apart is still the money.
Still the money, and also Senator Susan Collins going on to say it's defining what infrastructure is. Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins joins us now from D.C. for more. Emily, what is infrastructure seems to be the question that the Republican and Democratic parties are still arguing over.
Well, Jonathan, it's what is infrastructure, it's how to pay for it, it's exactly how big this package needs to be. Look, you saw the White House and President Biden come back with a counteroffer to Senate Republicans saying, you know what, we'll slim down our initial proposal. We're going to propose a $1.7 trillion package. And you saw Senate Republicans give that the cold shoulder on Friday, saying, look, that's way more than we can possibly support in an infrastructure package. At the same time, President Biden is facing a lot of pressure from his own party, from Democrats. You've seen a number of progressive lawmakers come out, say that President Biden, you know, they want to pass as big of a package as possible. They don't want to negotiate this down with Republicans. You saw a Rhode Island Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse recently tweeted that he feels that these negotiations on infrastructure are stuck in a quagmire because of the bipartisanship that they're trying to reach. And he makes a really quick reference there. We've seen this movie before. That's going back to 2009, the Affordable Care Act. Democrats really tried to work with Republicans on negotiations. They spent months and months and months on it, and not a single Republican voted for that bill. Democrats remember that. They don't want to have that happen again, and time is of the essence. We're already at the end of May, but Jonathan, the goal is not to pass a bill before the November 2022 elections. The goal is to pass a bill and then actually have that funding go through the process and get shovels in the ground and actual changes to infrastructure done by the start of November 2022. So when voters go to the polls, they have that in mind. So Democrats are looking at a very tight timetable here, and you're starting to see more and more congressional Democrats saying to President Biden, it's time, cut the cord, we need to go at this alone.
Yep, they want the electorate to see it, to feel it before they go to the polls. Great to catch up. Emily Wilkins there down in D.C. Still with us. Steve Weininger City, Troy Gajewski of Skybridge. Troy, have you had to curtail your expectations for what comes out of Washington?
Well, yeah, so I think when Biden was elected and then the Senate flipped, you know, it was clear we were going to get 9%, 8-9% of GDP in terms of fiscal stimulus. However, the expectation was that we might have one or even two more reconciliation bills this year, which would lead to even more growth in the short term, more potential inflationary pressure. But the real development is that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, you know, have really said no mas, right? So as long as they're pushing back, the infrastructure packages, further fiscal largesse will be limited to some extent, which ultimately diminishes that probability of an inflationary outcome slightly. We still think it's roughly 1 in 5, which means 4 in 5, you know, it's going to be transitory. And we think that's a good development all in all.
Steve, your line, a long period of secular disinflation has ended. Steve, is that dependent of what happens down in Washington next?
Well, it would be easier for the Federal Reserve if we were, in fact, building the size of government, right? It's interesting here. I think we should look at this fiscal plan. Certainly, there's probably not going to be any participation among Republicans that includes tax increases. So it's going to be negotiated between the right and left of the Democrat Party, just the way you heard. But it's got fiscal offsets. It has tax increases along with spending increases. This is completely different from what we saw in 2020 and 2021 with the emergency stimulus being money financed. So the Federal Reserve is easy, and it's going to tilt easy. It says that it's trying to make up for past disinflation. If we have a robust recovery, if the government does want to contribute to that credit demand, that'll make it a little bit easier for the Federal Reserve to achieve that end. And also, let's remember, if we look back at you mentioned 2009 in the last report about the lack of bipartisanship on spending. We had in 2010 massive commodity price increases, bigger than the ones that we've had now. We had a decade of disinflation that followed. This time around, fiscal policy and monetary policy, they're going bigger, and they're probably going to tilt up inflation somewhat.
On the metal side of things, you mentioned the commodity prices, Steve. Troy, I know you've got this view on a super cycle, and it's not a broad-based commodity story. It's copper, and copper on its own. Why is that, Troy?
Yeah, so again, if you look at the broader commodity complex, and let's use oil as an example, right? Oil has enjoyed a tremendous cyclical recovery, not only goosed by easy money, but also, better economic outcomes than I think most would have forecasted as recently as 6 months ago. But it has the twin threats of clean energy and fracking, right? In a less energy-intensive economies over time. When you flip the other side and you look at copper, copper is really the one commodity that you can make a bullish case from a demand supercycle standpoint, and it's because of the electrification of the world. Now, obviously it's had a huge run, it's due for a pullback, but if you look forward, it should take 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years for miners to catch up. And there's only so much aluminum you can substitute for it in the short term. So when we look at the commodity complex as a whole, that's really the only one you can make any credible case can enjoy a true super cycle.
Troy, good to catch up. As always, Troy Gajewski there of Skybridge, Steve Whiting of Citi. Thank you, gents. Got to turn back to that breaking story over the weekend and into this Monday morning. Let's catch up with Bloomberg's Guy Johnson out of London on the what next in Europe. Guy, what next?
Well, EU leaders are talking about this right now. This was going to be an EU summit, leaders gathering, not much really expected to come out of it. Certainly this narrative has hijacked, to use the phrase appropriately in relation to what has just happened, the whole kind of agenda. And we're now waiting to see what's going to happen, John. I think a number of things potentially on the table. There are certainly discussions at this stage about basically cutting off the air bridge from Minsk into the EU, maybe cutting off the land border as well. It's unclear at this point whether or not that would affect transit aircraft, but some EU countries are already starting to make their own kind of opinions felt and use their own airspace effectively as a bargaining tool here, John. It's going to be interesting to see whether Lithuania does this. It's already talking about the potential for banning transit, i.e. if you're coming out of Moscow, you're going through northern Belarus, you're then going into a bit of Latvia, and then you're going down to a number of German airports that use that route. Maybe you couldn't do that. Most southern routes still go kind of out of the EU via Poland, through Belarus, and then out to Moscow or out to Asia. But certain countries, John, potentially saying, you know what, if you want to do that, you can't use our airspace. So certainly the narrative has changed significantly around this EU summit. The question of already tight sanctions being tightened further looks like very much a real one at this point, John. We'll just see exactly where everybody lands again.
Well, Guy, let's talk about the rhetoric that's been used right now. And I just wonder how loaded the following phrase actually is. When they start talking about a state-sponsored act of terrorism and alluding to that kind of thing, just how important is that language this morning on what could come eventually later on this evening into tomorrow?
Well, I think there's certainly outrage, John. But whether or not that outrage actually translates into something material, we will wait and see. Clearly, there is a kind of there's sort of two narratives around this. One, do you want to affect what is happening inside Belarus, or do you want to, as often sanctions are used for, appeal to your own domestic base, be seen to doing something? So it'll be interesting to see which way we come down on this one. But certainly there is energy behind this process now, energy within this process to make further changes, to tighten the sanctions further. And I think certainly cutting off transport is something that is being considered. But that does come with risks, because effectively you are cutting off a population which may be opposed to the regime in Minsk, and that is certainly something that I think the EU leaders are going to have to think quite carefully about. Sanctions are already fairly tight on this regime.
Guy, looking forward to the coverage starting at 10 Eastern in about 37 minutes' time. It is the dilemma for European leaders. How do you punish the state, the government, without isolating the people and pushing the country further towards Russia? That's the European problem this morning. Coming up, the morning calls, and later, European equities leading the rally this year, with the Buy Europe chorus growing even louder on Wall Street. That conversation coming up with Jay Jacobs of Global X Funds and Federated's Debbie Cunningham. This is Bloomberg. Five minutes away from the opening bell this morning. Good morning. Equity futures doing nicely on the S&P 500, advancing 0.6%. Let's get you some morning calls. A look at some of the analyst recommendations this morning. First up, Citi, upgrading HP to a buy ahead of Thursday's results. The analysts expecting PC demand to remain resilient. Next up, Bank of America, downgrading Dollar General to underperform. The analysts seeing headwinds stemming from higher gasoline prices and rising wages. And finally, Bernstein, upgrading Beyond Meat to outperform from underperform. The analysts expecting state reopenings to fuel a significant jump in food sales. Coming up, Wall Street warming up to Europe with stocks on the continent leading the global rally. That conversation next with Jay Jacobs of Global X Funds and Federated's Debbie Cunningham from New York. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, traders, it's time to place stop on profit for euro, and I'm placing a stop on profit at 122.11.7, just right here. Okay, so whatever happened, you will not lose anything. You will end up in profit. So if you decided to follow trade from the beginning, if you decided to copy this trade, please place stop on profit and then we will see if it will move higher. We will place stop on profit higher. If it will move lower, you will close this trade with profit. Okay, this is how it works. I'll speak to you later, guys. By the way, from today we opened new TV channel on Twitch. So you can go to twitch.tv/sgtrader and you can watch as well live trading channel and enjoy as well if you're able to watch from apps. If it's more convenient for you, please do so. I'll speak to you later.
Valuations, particularly sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash, $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
23 seconds away from the opening bell in New York City this morning. Good morning to you all. Coming off the back of 2 weeks of losses on the S&P 500. Here's your bounce back. Up 24 on the S&P, on a Russell, up by about 0.5%. Your outperformance this morning coming from the NASDAQ. There's the opening bell. Switch up the board and get to the bond market. Your 10-year Treasury yield this morning shaping up as follows. 161.31. Yields in about a basis point. Euro dollar. Stronger euro, weaker dollar. Euro dollar 122.15. Up about 1/3%. And crude just south of 65 at 64.71. We're positive there by 1.75%. That is the cross-asset story this Monday at the market desk with your movers. Here's Abby.
John, let's start out with some stocks that are helping this bullish open on the week. And of course, one of them really taking off is Virgin Galactic, the 7th update in a row, absolutely soaring. This after the company did put up a successful test flight over the weekend. A very big winning streak here, up about 70% now over the last 7 days. We also have AMC trading higher on the meme stock theme, plus the reopening, and Apple getting a bid, up 0.6%. This, of course, on day 2 of the Epic trial, but we also have yields down, helping out Apple. As for the wild ride over the weekend, John, that had everything to do with the crypto space. At one point, Bitcoin was down 8%, yesterday up 12%. Reverse that. Today up 12%. As a result, we have the crypto-related stocks getting a little bit of a bounce, John.
Abby, thank you. About a minute in, the S&P 500 up by 0.5%. The financials lagging a little bit, but still positive. Every single sector, industry right now is positive on a session, up by about 0.25% on financials. Information technology, top of the pile, up 0.8%. That's the States. Over in Europe, equities very much still in the spotlight, moving from lagger to leader. The Euro Stoxx 50 now outperforming all other global equities this year. For more, it's Bloomberg's Taylor Riggs. Hey, Taylor.
Who knew, right? This wasn't in any of the calls I read when we started.
Okay, guys. Okay, position closed on British pound. On euro, on British pound. Position closed on euro at 122.117. You can collect your profit. In our case, we have 200 pounds in profit because every pip gives us 200 pounds. In your case, it's all about how much you decided to invest when you decided to trade this pair. So you can invest 30, 50 pounds, 10 pounds. So 2 pips will give you profit based on the how much you decided to invest for this pair. Let's move on. Let's look for another chance and opportunity to trade Forex. Stay safe.
Downs And finally, the commodity space with the metals prices driving up some of the big basic resources and the materials sector.
Taylor Riggs, thank you. On a price action, both stateside and over in Europe as well. We've got to talk about the politics in Europe at the moment. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo out of Brussels, just ahead of that European Leaders Summit. Maria, great to catch up with you. Just walk us through the agenda for the next several hours in Brussels.
Well, it very much is about Belarus and what to do now after that plane was essentially hijacked. And the thing to really factor here, Jonathan, is that this situation is very much unprecedented. This is a flight that was going from Greece to Lithuania. These are two member states of the European Union, and halfway through the flight, mid-flight, gets diverted into Minsk in what is now clearly a military operation to arrest an opposition journalist to Lukashenko. So for the European leaders, it's very much reacting to that, what kind of sanctions we're going to get from that position, and of course now reports from Lufthansa, another plane potentially grounded in Minsk, that makes this even more concerning now.
Maria, often easy to identify the differences, the divisions between European leaders. Are you getting a sense of unity this time around?
Yeah, and Jonathan, that's a great point, because the problem with European foreign policy, as you know, is that you have to agree 27 countries, which at times are very different and have very different interests. But in this case, I would say it's different, and they do all realize that this could set a very dangerous precedent. We've heard the word terrorism being thrown around today here, and they all agree this is European airspace. If we let this one go, it could happen across Europe. So it does set a very dangerous precedent.
Maria, stay close, because I know those European leaders are entering that meeting over the next several hours, and as you cross them, if you get hold of one, we'll try and take that live on this program. Thank you. Elsewhere, for the equity market in Europe, JP Morgan's Michael Bell expecting vaccinations to provide the next boost for European stocks.
If you look at the daily pace of vaccinations in Europe now, it's actually caught up to the UK. So I think you're going to see in the third quarter pick up in the domestic economy as well. So I think European equities will move higher. Whether they outperform something like the US, I personally have a preference for, say, US financials to European financials, but I still think that European equities will go higher.
Let's bring in Debbie Cunningham of Federated Hermes and Jay Jacobs of Global X ETFs on this situation. Debbie, I want to begin with you. A lot of people out there believe that what's about to happen in Europe, and I'm not talking about the politics, I'll allow the two of you to avoid that discussion. What's about to happen in Europe with the economy will unlock higher rates in Europe and provide the next leg for rates here in America. Debbie, do you agree?
I'm not sure it starts in Europe, but I do believe the unlocking of rates needs to begin. I think, it was mentioned by Taylor, the huge amount of liquidity that's in the system, both in Europe as well as in the United States. What's happening from, a buyback standpoint that continues with both of those central banks. And what that, I think, effectively opens us up for, along with, the huge amount in consumer savings that we have and, what's considered kind of a wall of cash that's waiting to be put to work. The transitory inflation may not be so transitory. You've got small disruptions, things like, sort of the shortage on chips. We mentioned auto industry outperformance.